Hey co-pilots, it's author Dean M. Cole with a quick note before your audiobook starts. This is the new R.C. Bray narration of Retribution, Sector 64, Book 2. Links for Ambush, Sector 64, Book 1 are in the description. I've broken this audiobook into 3 parts, just like I did with Ambush. This is part 1. Links for parts 2 and 3 will be in the description. If you want a commercial-free copy, you can buy direct from me. Just click here. There's a little card that'll pop up. Anyway, it's half the cost of an Audible credit. It'll save you money and it'll help me out. Lastly, if you'd rather the original Mike Ortego narrations, those links will be in the description as well. That's it. Thanks. Enjoy the audiobook. Bye.
Blue Heron Audio presents Retribution, Sector 64, Book 2, by Dean M. Cole, read by R.C. Bray. Part 1. Infuse your life with action. Don't wait for it to happen. Make it happen. Make your own future. Make your own hope. Make your own love. And whatever your beliefs, honor your Creator, not by passively waiting for grace to come down from upon high, but by doing what you can to make grace happen. Yourself, right now, right down here on Earth. Bradley Whitford. Chapter 1. "This cold is going to be the death of me," Romulcan Thramarus said as he trudged through another waist-deep snow dune. Pulling the nanobot-enhanced parka tight around his ears, he lowered his head into the frigid gale. Buffeting him, it threatened to blow Romulcan back to the empty transport hovering to his rear. Leaning into the wind, the scientist looked through his eyebrows. Ahead, a jagged rock protruded a few stories above the ice plain. Buried under the polar ice cap, a huge mountain, hundreds of times taller than the visible portion, spread out beneath the camp. Only a month earlier, a construction crew had finished boring a science station into the mountain's exposed triangular peak. The camp's sole entrance lay ahead of Romulcan. Behind and to the sides of the lone scientist, the white plain stretched to the horizon, disappearing into the pole's perpetual night. Interrupted only by the snow dunes that always seemed to occupy the space between him and his destination, the surface was otherwise perfectly flat. Anchored at the pole of the newly settled planet, this part of the ice field sat motionlessly. Sub-zero temperatures and a thick, stable ice sheet that insulated the site from the planet's iron-rich surface made it the perfect region for Romulcan's experiment. One snow dune later, the scientist trudged up to the smooth outer skin of the camp's entrance. With the sound of tearing paper, a rectangular opening appeared in its seamless surface. A force field-entrained bubble of heated atmosphere ballooned out and wrapped him in its warm embrace. The scientist stepped through the hatch-shaped opening, an action that breathed life into the ancient memories of his brief military stint. A lifetime ago, a much younger petty officer Thramarus had haunted the vast halls of an Argonian-manned battlecruiser. Dusting the frost from his ample belly, he frowned. In the years since his 3-year all-expenses-paid tour with the Galactic Defense Forces, his forehead had become a 5-head, and his 6-pack looked more like a 12-pack. Romulcan stepped through the inner door into the compound's main room. In mercurial rivulets, billions of nanobots streamed from his bib and parka. No longer needed for insulation, the omnifunctional microscopic robots flowed into the mottled gray floor, rejoining the facility's matrix. The parka and bib morphed to their normal volume and function as a day shirt and pants. Excited to share the bounty of data garnered at the pole, Romulcan forgot about the day's isolation. He dusted the last of the frost from his shirt and looked around. His smile faltered. Why was it so quiet? Why was the common room empty? At this hour it should be bustling with activity. Thramarus shook his head. "I'm back," he said, yelling toward the back rooms. "Is everyone on break?" Silence. Raising his voice, he said, "I go away for 1 day and you all take a holiday?" Nothing. "Hello?" Anger and the first hint of concern chased away his good cheer. Guys, this isn't funny. All he heard was his voice's fading echo floating in the still air. Determined to find someone, he walked and then jogged through the subterranean compound. Hello? Still no answer. Now panting, he ran from room to room. They were all empty. He even checked the ladies' restroom. As Remulkin turned to exit, he saw movement. After a confused moment, he realized the scared, middle-aged, portly man was him. Blinking and wheezing, Remulkin studied his reflection in the vanity mirror. His normally pale, freckled skin was ruddy, glowing above and below his ring of red and gray hair. His mother had once told him that you never really see yourself until you think you're looking at someone else. He shook his head and turned from the unsettling image. Finally catching his breath in the camp's elevation-thinned atmosphere, Remulkin exited the restroom and walked to the last door, his quarters. Shaking his head after a final confused glimpse back toward the entrance, he stepped into the room and jumped right the hell back out. A body had popped into existence in front of his face, in the middle of his private room. "Damn holograms!" he screamed, once his pounding heart and hitching breath permitted speech. "Sorry about that, Mr. Thramerus," said an uncharacteristically dour-looking Phalange Mecklem. His assistant, usually jovial to the point of annoyance, stared grimly from the pre-recorded hologram. Annoyed at the intrusion into his quarters, holographic or not, Remulkin searched for the deactivation key. "I know how much you hate these things, but I don't have time for anything else." There it is, he thought as he found the virtual shut-off key floating on the front right corner of the hologram. Remulkin reached for it. As if reacting to the scientist's movement, his assistant held up a hand. "This is important, sir. You'll want to hear it." His finger hovered over the virtual button. Then Thramerus pulled it back as if he touched a hot surface. What the hell was he thinking? His disgust with the invasion of his privacy had banished all other concerns. Remulkin's wife would have loved that one. She was always saying he was too stuffy, too worried about privacy and personal space. She had begged him to let them connect their electro-organic networks to the colony's matrix. Then they could use the neurally implanted eons to stay in constant contact. Oh, joy, Remulkin thought. In the hologram, a running man bumped into Phalange. The assistant lunged forward. Remulkin heard a shouted apology. Regaining his feet, the man pushed his tousled blonde hair out of his eyes and appeared to stare at Remulkin. The uncharacteristic seriousness in the young man's eyes had Remulkin's short hairs standing on end. Mecklem pointed a thumb over his shoulder. "The sensor network detected a Zoxith fleet entering our galactic sector." "My gods," Remulkin whispered. The assistant continued. "We're all leaving to be with our families. Everything should be fine. The Galactic Defense Forces can't be far behind." Another person ran through the passage. "Sorry." Phalange waved at the person and then continued. "We tried to call you in, but couldn't detect your terminal." "Shit!" Remulkin shouted. A sinking feeling struck his gut as he recalled disabling his hand terminal's external link during the experiment. Phalange continued speaking as Remulkin worked to activate his terminal. "Sorry for the short message. We have to get on the transport. As soon as it drops me off, I'll set its autopilot to return for you. Anyway, I'm sure this is an overreaction. The GDF has those green-blooded ancestor-worshipping lizards on their heels. Don't they?" As holographic Phalange began to dematerialize, Remulkin saw a look of trepidation leak through the man's brave facade. "No, no, no," Remulkin said, growling in frustration. Hunched over the hand terminal, he tapped furiously. "Come on!" The scientist shared his assistant's apprehension. They were at war with the Zoxith. The fanatical leader of the reptilian race had declared a holy war against all Argonians. He had sworn to right an ancient wrong, to avenge a supposed Argonian attempt to wreak genocide upon their sacrosanct forebearers. The visceral Lord Thrax had vowed to eradicate every last Argonian from the galaxy. A chill ran down Remulkin's spine. Finally, his terminal finished its digital handshake and connected to the station's network. A multi-pitched storm of audio alerts announced a flood of messages and warnings. Red strobing icons streamed across his screen. Oh, gods. This was bad. Real bad. Remulkin scrolled through the news updates and government alerts in sequence. Most had timestamps more recent than the assistant's message. They painted a picture of a rapidly deteriorating situation. City after city in this newly settled world had fallen silent. The arrival of an enemy ship preceded each event. Reports of a brilliant light. Then nothing. All contact with the area lost. On the final news clip, Remulkin watched as the gods damned aliens closed in on the last settlement. His new hometown. In this new colony, everyone lived in or near a town. Whatever the bastards were doing, they had done it to every settlement, every man, every woman, every child. Save his. Now Remulkin's home was in their sights. The last item on his terminal, a recorded video message, opened. "Baby, I'm scared," his wife said. "Why won't you pick up?" Fareen's eyes pleaded. "I need you, baby." In the background, daylight streamed through the windows of their home. Suddenly they darkened, as if a black cloud had passed overhead. "Oh my God, they're here now," she said, her voice cracking with fear. Remulkin touched the image of her face. "Fareen!" His pounding heart threatened to burst from his chest. To either side, his son and daughter clutched at their mother. At 9 years old, their son Wilby stood taller than his younger sister Freena. His wife stared into the camera he'd mounted over the kitchen door. She'd asked him to put it there. That way, the scientist could watch his wife's experiments with cooking, just one of the many things they'd both had to learn as colonists on a new settlement. "Remulkin," she said, her eyes pleading. "Why aren't you answering?" Through tear-muddled eyes, he saw unnatural light burst through the room's window coverings, curtains Fareen had painstakingly selected for their new home. "Baby!" his wife screamed as she doubled over. Collapsing at her feet, both of their children cried out, writhing in pain. The yellow light's brilliance and his family's shrieks grew until the image completely washed out. "Fareen!" Remulkin screamed. "Oh, gods! Wilby! Freena! No!" Remulkin stared helplessly into the whited-out image. "No," he said again in a weak whisper. The light streaming through his splayed fingers faded and then disappeared, taking their screams with it. And then there was deafening silence. "Fareen," Thramorus said through his constricted throat. Pulling his hand away, he watched as color and shadow returned to the image. 3 unrecognizable, multicolored clumps sat where his family had been. Trying to blink the tears from his vision, Remulkin pulled the screen closer. Still arranged as they had been when their wearers had fallen, his family's emptied garments lay strewn across the kitchen floor. "No, no, no," Remulkin uttered between whimpers. Clutching the terminal to his chest, he rocked back and forth. Then, keening like a mortally wounded animal, the last man on the planet collapsed to the floor. Chapter 2. Under a 3/4 moon, an angular white space fighter flew through a vast field of tumbling ghost ships. Ahead of the weaving vessel sat a swelling black void, a hole cut into the field of stars. Inside the small starfighter, United States Air Force pilot Captain Jake Giard squinted, trying to resolve some detail, hell, anything, within the wide, gaping maw of starless space. He could almost imagine they were flying into the event horizon of an elongated black hole. But it was no rift. No, this was a ship. A damned big one. As they neared the enormous, stealthy carrier, it blotted out a sizable portion of the universe. None of the crisp, brilliant stars that crowded the rest of the sky reflected off of its light-absorbing skin. Named the Galactic Guardian, The 3-mile-long alien carrier hovered 200 miles over the North Atlantic, defying gravity. For now. A few hours ago, thousands of Argonians had lived aboard the mammoth vessel. Like the hundreds of other vessels crowding this moon-sized region of space, it too was an empty ghost ship, and Jake needed to find a way to board it. If he didn't get in there soon, things were going to get significantly worse. Considering the day's events, that was saying a lot. The colonel had crammed Captain Giard into the small space behind the single-seat fighter's sole ejection seat. Now his legs were going to sleep. Jake shifted his weight to return circulation to his numb extremities. In front of him, the squared-off gray and white flat top that protruded above the ejection seat twisted left and right. "Son of a bitch," Colonel Zach Newcastle said, shaking his head. Tugging at the ejection seat's shoulder harnesses, Newcastle managed to turn his upper body. Regarding Jake with his left eye, the colonel cocked a salt and pepper eyebrow. "I thought the enemy ships were huge." He pointed through the fighter's bubble-shaped canopy. "I knew it was damn big. You could see that when they showed up." He paused. "But God, there must have been thousands of people in there." Facing forward, Newcastle settled back into the seat. He shook his head. "Shit," he said again in a hoarse whisper, drawing the word out into 2 syllables. "Yes, sir," Jake said with a nod. "The whole thing is royally fucked." Newcastle rested his elbow on the spacesuit helmet he'd stowed on the left console. The big man scratched his head. Thick fingers left short-lived furrows in the stiff bristles of his graying flat top. Casting a nervous look over his right shoulder, Jake scanned the battlefield. Several kilometers behind them, a broken and burned asteroid hung motionlessly against the backdrop of stars. It was the tattered dead remnant of the only remaining enemy ship. Every time he looked that way, Jake half expected to find the asteroid bearing down on them, the alien face sculpted across its 100-meter width glaring at him. A mental image of spraying arterial blood crowded out his thoughts. Jake shook away the memory, forcing out the unbidden image. He focused on the enemy ship. It still wasn't following them, but he knew it never would. Jake and his wingman, Captain Richard Allison, had searched the interior of the hollowed-out asteroid. There weren't any enemy aliens left. None living, anyway. Of course, there weren't any friendly aliens left either. A few weeks ago, Jake had been a simple fighter pilot, just an Air Force officer training for another combat deployment to the Middle East. In preparation for the air war against ISIS, Jake and a wingman had taken a pair of F-22s out on a night training exercise over Las Vegas's Nellis Air Force Base. Events of that night had led to Jake's presence here today. Now he and Colonel Newcastle, an officer he hadn't known until a few hours ago, drifted across a cluttered battlefield in a human-made spaceship, a space fighter that Jake hadn't known existed before this morning. Hundreds of tumbling ships of varying sizes drifted around the mammoth galactic guardian, all of them undamaged. They were also fully functional and completely devoid of life. As far as Jake knew, the 2 of them were the only living souls in Earth orbit. Captain Giard shook his head. No, not orbit. Hell, things would have been a lot easier if they had been in orbit, if the battle hadn't taken place at a relative hover. One of the first lessons a fighter pilot learned was that in aerial combat, speed and altitude are the currency of life. Without one or both, a fighter pilot wasn't long for this world. Here they had altitude, had it in spades, but in space, the lack of orbital speed rendered said altitude a liability. Gravity drives held every one of these ships aloft. A reverse-engineered version of the same technology even held their small space fighter up here as well. As Jake had already seen, if a ship's gravity drive failed, the vessel would drop like Wile E. Coyote 1 second after he chased the Roadrunner over the cliff's edge. During the battle, far below a geostationary altitude and nowhere near orbital speed, anything that had lost its protective gravity bubble had fallen like a homesick rock. In the aftermath, small drifting space fighters didn't pose much of a threat to the planet below. However, Hundreds of incredibly massive ships hung 200 miles above the North Atlantic Ocean like the hammer of God, stayed by a slowly unraveling technological thread. Only gravity drives and their currently unmonitored power systems held the enemy asteroid ship, as well as the Argonian carrier and its complement of stadium-sized battle cruisers at bay. Without one of the two, they'd instantly drop into the planet's gravity well, a lesson Jake had relearned only a few minutes earlier. After he and Captain Richard Allison had finished sweeping the alien asteroid, they had parted ways. Newcastle had instructed Richard to take a small spaceship called the Turtle back to Nellis Air Force Base for supplies and personnel. Anyway, the two ships had no means of coupling. Without a docking connector, Jake's transfer to the Colonel's ship had required a spacewalk. From the Turtle's airlock, Captain Giard had saluted the Colonel. "Permission aboard, sir." Newcastle had returned the salute, then waved impatiently. "Let's go, Captain." After a moment to estimate the vector and necessary force, Jake pushed off of the Turtle. As soon as he had cleared the round-topped ship, he'd foolishly notified Richard of the fact. Unlike its namesake, the Turtle was fast, the now-you-see-it, now-you-don't kind of fast. Jake slowly floated across 4 feet of open space with his hands extended toward Newcastle's fighter. He felt a brief flutter in his abdomen, and the Colonel's ship rocketed upward. To his right, Jake saw the speed-blurred image of the Turtle blazing toward the western horizon. Richard had left for Nevada. He shifted confused eyes to Newcastle's fading fighter. Colonel Newcastle, where are you going, sir?" Then Jake saw another problem. Every ship in the battlefield had flown away from him. Oh, shit. He had swapped one 0G frame of reference for another. Jake was falling. Of course, he'd felt like he was falling as soon as he stepped out of the Turtle's 1G interior field and into its external 0G buffer, but now he was truly falling. And truly fucked if nothing changed. Like Wile E. Coyote, Jake fell feet first into Earth's gravity well. He could almost see the cartoon swoosh above his head. Unlike said cartoon character, Jake didn't have a help sign to hold up. So he screamed it. "Help!" Nothing. No one responded. As far as he knew, his suit's radio was only designed for short ranges, although this was the first day he'd ever used one. "Richard!" No reply. "Colonel!" "Hang on, Captain. Almost there," Newcastle said, sounding maddeningly calm. Jake's body had rolled forward a few degrees. That might have had something to do with his flailing arms. Craning his neck, he looked upward again. A bright point of light moved against the backdrop of stars. In seconds, it expanded into a space fighter. Thank God. Hyperventilating and not wanting to look down, Jake focused on the fighter. With 150 miles of empty space between him and the upper reaches of the atmosphere, he didn't want to think about how fast he'd be going when he got there. So, of course, it was all he could think about. His heart pounded in his ears. Wide-eyed, he watched as Newcastle matched his acceleration. Then the Air Force colonel overtook him and slid his ship under Jake. From Jake's perspective, the colonel's fighter had swooped in from above, but now it hovered under him. "Holy shit!" Jake screamed. The Atlantic Ocean already looked closer. "Don't look down, Captain," Newcastle said. He pointed 2 fingers at his own eyes. "Focus on me." Jake did as the officer said. After a moment, he reined in his breathing and stopped flapping his arms. "That's better," the colonel said. The space fighter slid a few feet closer. Jake felt a flutter in his abdomen again. For a second, he floated a couple of feet above the fighter. Then, the ship's internal 1G gravity field pulled him onto the ship's outer skin. The smooth metal surface sloped toward the ship's edge. Jake started to slide toward the precipice. "Oh, fuck!" The fighter's bubble canopy shot upward. A vice-like hand clamped down on his forearm. Before Jake knew what was happening, the big man had dragged him into the cockpit. After a few seconds, he caught his breath. Swallowing hard, Jake fought to rein in his racing heart. His suit's helmet retracted as the cockpit pressurized. "Sorry about that, Captain," Newcastle said, his Texas accent even thicker in person. "My fault. Should have let Allison know that my gravity bubble doesn't reach as far as the turtles. I can't believe Richard didn't come back. He didn't know. I didn't radio him. Figured I could get you." Jake blinked. "I'm glad you were so sure, sir." Newcastle twisted his helmet and removed it. Setting it on the left console, he gave Jake a crooked sideways grin and winked. "You're welcome, Captain." That had been several minutes ago. Now they were back, flying through the field of slowly tumbling ghost ships. Jake's stomach knotted up again as his thoughts returned to their final battle in the Zoxith ship. Every time he thought of the short, close-quarters battle, the image of Victor's spraying arterial blood filled his mind's eye. Captain Giard shifted his gaze outside. The real-world image of an emptied Galactic Defense Force fleet pushed out the memory and the doubts it fed. A GDF starfighter tumbled past them. The ship was a smaller, sleeker version of the Turtle, not unlike the vessel he'd encountered less than 3 weeks earlier during the training flight. The fateful events of that night had embroiled Jake in a decades-long, well-intentioned global conspiracy. The world was going to change for the better, and Jake was going to be part of it. Apparently, a lost colony of Argonians, or humans as we call ourselves, had been stranded on this planet tens of thousands of years ago. In the intervening millennia, we lost touch with that past and integrated with or eliminated the indigenous populations, as witnessed by the disappearance of Cro-Magnon man and the recent finding of Neanderthal genes mixed with our own. But humanity was no longer a lost colony. After detecting nuclear detonations in backwater galactic Sector 64, the Argonian leadership of the United Galactic Federation sent agents to establish first contact. The emissaries arrived in the year locally designated as 1947. They soon discovered the planet was inhabited by Argonians. Their initial foray into Earth's space ended in tragedy, an incident popularly known as Roswell. After recovering from that unfortunate event, the emissaries met with world leaders of the day. They laid out a 75-year plan to incorporate our world into the galactic government. In spite of our genetic relationship, the Argonians decided to follow their standard integration protocols. During the intervening decades, the process had streamlined our global culture and economy for inclusion in galactic society. As Jake had learned, we were approaching the point of disclosure, the time when the entrusted governments could reveal the secret to the world. Then, Zox happened. This morning, a fleet of 16 city-sized asteroid ships showed up on our doorstep. The Zoxith, an ancient reptilian race with a deep-seated hate for Argonians, attacked Earth. They'd used a new weapon of a type and capability that even the GDF hadn't anticipated. The whole thing had been a coup de main, a ruse to draw the Galactic Defense Forces into an ambush. Jake shook his head as he considered the tragic irony. Our genetic lineage had made us the perfect pawn. The bastards had hit us with a genocidal weapon that eradicated anyone with Argonian genes. Unfortunately, the GDF had been late to the party. In less than an hour, the fleet of 16 asteroid ships depopulated most of the world's capital cities. Jake had seen the aftermath firsthand. The weapon left nothing but a pile of clothes where the person had been. Everything else remained untouched. Birds chirped, banal elevator music maddened. Driverless automobiles and unpiloted airplanes meant fiery ends. You know, typical end-of-the-world shit. Shit for which even dozens of apocalyptic movies and books hadn't prepared Jake. He shook his head again. A lot of good that integration plan and our genetic lineage had done. Too bad our ancestors hadn't mixed with a few more Neanderthals. Maybe a little more genetic diversity would have rendered the enemy's gene weapon ineffective. Jake pointed at the Galactic Guardian. Would it have killed the bastards to give us a little heads up? A simple, oh, by the way, there's a race of giant pissed-off reptiles out there. Here are some ships to defend yourself would have been nice. Without responding, the colonel leveled off the fighter a few feet above the carrier's hull. Jake still hadn't seen an access point. He pointed over the colonel's shoulder. I think their fighters launched out of the back of the ship. Newcastle nodded. That's where I'm headed. Below the space fighter's belly, the Galactic Guardian's skin flowed like black mercury. To Jake's left and right, curled protrusions of unknown purpose scrolled past like frozen waves on a sable river. "You know," Newcastle said softly, "they did ultimately give their lives." "What, sir?" "Those bastards you mentioned. They sacrificed themselves for us." Jake felt his face flush. The reason these ships were now empty was because the Galactic Defense Forces had stayed in the battle, even after Jake had warned the GDF commander about the effects of the enemy's weapon. Ultimately, the commander and his troops had sacrificed themselves to save Earth. Jake wanted to shout at the colonel. Yeah, a lot of Argonians had died here today, but down there, millions more had lost their lives. Jake ground his teeth together. The image of Victor's head falling to the floor, followed a second later by his body, flooded Jake's reddening vision. "Son," Newcastle said in a paternal tone, "I know what's really eating you. I told you not to kick yourself." "Excuse me, sir? From what you told me, Lieutenant Croft died a hero." Jake's head snapped back as if the colonel had slapped him. In a day chock full of fucked up shit, somehow Victor's death weighed heaviest on him. The colonel was right. Jake shook his head, and his shoulders slumped as the fight left him. "If I'd acted quicker, sir, he might still be alive." "Quicker? You were the one who realized it was a ruse, that the Zocs were using our genetic ties with the Argonians to draw the Galactic Defense Forces into a sneak attack. If you hadn't figured out the enemy's plan when you did, they would have wiped out the GDF. My call didn't do them much good." Jake pointed at the empty Galactic Guardian. "They still got wiped out. Yeah, but not before the good guys hit first. Your quick thinking allowed them to take out all but the last ship. If you hadn't warned them, the Zoxith would have fired that damned weapon with their entire fleet still intact. How many millions or billions more would have died?" Jake turned from Newcastle and looked at the battle-blasted remnant of the enemy ship. The colonel's words sent a chill down his spine. The Zoxith vessels weren't as big as the carrier, but they dwarfed the GDF's battle cruisers. All 16 had been unique, each a collection of hollowed-out asteroids held together by trusses and skyscraper-sized metal structures. Serving as the ship's bridge, a huge, sculpted Zoxith bust with a human skull clenched in its jaw headed each. Literally. After Jake had warned the Galactic Defense Forces, the Argonians opened fire, hitting the Zoxith fleet with a continuous laser barrage. The GDF commander, Admiral Thord Fedyak, told them that an enemy ship under an active shield couldn't fire the gene weapon. They had to keep the enemy pinned down. No matter the consequences, they had to keep the Zoxith ships under constant fire. The humans had remained outside of the gene weapon's range. However, the Argonian fleet was trapped between the enemy ships and the planet. They couldn't get out of range, not without leaving Earth unprotected. As some of his lasers diverted to vaporizing debris falling from the hovering enemy fleet, the GDF admiral had requested assistance from Colonel Newcastle's space fighters. The combined firepower of Argonian lasers and human nuclear bunker busters had peeled back the defending ships like layers of an onion. Finally, only the scorched bridge section of the commander's ship remained. However, as the last missile closed in on the unshielded ship remnant, the bastard had fired the gene weapon. In the millisecond between the failure of the last shield and the impact of the missile, the genocidal weapon's energy waves surged across the battlefield, completely enveloping the GDF fleet. In the blink of an eye, every Argonian in the Galactic Defense Force's hundreds of ships ceased to exist. Hovering in the middle of the surreal scene, the intact alien face chiseled into the front of the enemy bridge glared across the battlefield. The final bunker buster had passed through the hollowed-out asteroid without detonating. Jake, Richard, and Victor had boarded the ship remnant armed with only pistols and shotguns. Inside, they met no resistance. At first, only mangled enemy bodies greeted their arrival. Then they found their first and last living Zoxith on the top floor of the bridge. The massive, heavily injured reptilian beast had attacked with a ferocity Jake hadn't thought possible. Unscathed by multiple shotgun blasts, the monster attacked Richard. In an instant of uncharacteristic valor, Jake's junior wingman, Lieutenant Victor Croft, charged the beast. Looking over the colonel's shoulder, Jake consulted the fighter's clock. Only 2 hours earlier, the enemy commander had beheaded his friend and wingman. Jake hadn't reacted fast enough to save him. "Hell, son," Newcastle said softly. "I owe you a great debt. Because of you, I'll get to see my grandchildren again." Not waiting for a reply, he patted Jake's protruding knee. "Now let's get back to work." After a long pause, Jake nodded. "Yes, sir." Chapter 3. "Nellis Tower, this is Turtle 1, over," said Captain Richard Allison. "Roger, Turtle 1, this is Nellis Tower. I don't have you on radar. Please state aircraft position and type." "Nellis Tower, I'm currently 50 miles south, descending out of flight level 2,500. After a pregnant pause, the air traffic controller returned with a condescending tone. "Lieutenant, you're either at flight level 25, that's 2,500 feet, by the way, or you're at flight level 250, which is 25,000 feet. Otherwise, son, you're in outer space. I think your training aircraft would have a little trouble operating at 250,000 feet." Having just survived the longest day of his life, Richard was in no mood to deal with this asshole. "Nellis Tower, you're right. I'm not in space. Anymore. I'm now descending through flight level 1,000, and yes, that's 100,000 feet. I'm 25 miles south with airport information. Charlie. I'd like to land directly to Alpha Ramp. Please notify General Pearson that I'll be landing in 2 minutes." After another pause, the air traffic controller's suddenly very accommodating and nervous voice returned. "Roger, Turtle 1, you're cleared directly to the ramp. Say type, please." "Nellis Tower, that'll be self-evident in a moment." Roger, Turtle 1. Cleared direct to the ramp," the tower controller repeated. "Please advise when you have the landing area in sight." In the background, Richard heard a second, more animated voice, tearing the controller a new asshole. Turtle 1, I've been advised that a vehicle is there waiting for you." "Roger, Tower, good copy. Cleared direct. I'll report landing area in sight." Reaching a relatively low altitude, the Turtle leveled off at 1,000 feet. Approaching Las Vegas from the southwest, Richard began a gradual deceleration as he steered the ship toward Nellis Air Force Base on the far side of the city. Barely discernible in the dark, the Turtle's light-absorbing skin rendered it a virtual black hole. Lost in the city's significant light pollution, the ship should be all but invisible from the ground, the only evidence of its passing a sequential eclipsing of the few background stars bright enough to penetrate Las Vegas's glowing atmosphere. Richard watched through the ship's forward view wall as McCarran International Airport passed on his right. He was thankful for the late hour and the ship's stealthy features. Considering the day's events, he knew there'd be no shortage of people willing to take pot shots at anything alien, and the Turtle was truly alien. The Air Force captain looked over his shoulder at the shrouded body lying on the floor. The junior officer of the team, Lieutenant Victor Croft, had given his all in the battle. Victor's actions had saved Richard and enabled their final victory over the 8-foot-tall enemy commander. Captain Allison turned his attention back to the city. In the Turtle's roomy first floor, he stood between the ship's 3-foot-wide center column and the 4-foot-tall control panel that lay halfway to the Turtle's forward perimeter. His fingers danced over the pedestal's concave glass surface. The commands activated a room-spanning hologram. A vortex of swarming pixels coalesced into a 3-dimensional rendering of the city and its surrounding topology. Richard's upper body protruded above the hologram like a man wading through an ocean of sand. In the image, a miniature version of Sunrise Mountain stood on his right, well east of the airport. To the west, the steep, jagged cliffs of Red Rock Canyon National Conservation Area framed the left side of the display. Rendered in various colors that signified elevation and differentiated man-made from natural features, the display made the long runways and low military buildings of Nellis Air Force Base easily identifiable. With his index finger pressed to thumb, Richard reached into the hologram with his right hand. Touching the center of the holographic rendering of the base's runway complex, he spread his fingers apart. As it would with a multi-touch smartphone display, the gesture magnified the image. The airfield expanded. The enlarged rendering clearly showed individual runways and taxiways. Richard made a rotating gesture, and the display spun 180 degrees, bringing Alpha Ramp to the forefront. Spotting his desired landing zone, Richard extended his index finger and poked it into the virtual tarmac. The double click of an oil can pop echoed through the 50-foot-wide interior. Concentric rings radiated across the hologram from his point of touch. Now that the autopilot's approach was programmed, Richard shut off the display. The pixels fell to the floor and faded away. Looking through the turtle's uni-translucent forward view wall, he watched Vegas's ocean of sparkling lights spool under the ship. Named because of its distinctive shape, the turtle was roughly 60 feet wide and 30 feet tall. Girdling its widest point, a horizontal 3-foot-thick bulge ringed the entire ship, delineating its flat-bottomed bowl of a belly from its domed top. The turtle had 3 interior levels. An airlock formed the only traversable portion of the belly. Above that, the main floor spanned the entire interior width of the ship. Only a closet-sized airlock access and the central column interrupted its open space. Additional features, like the now-present control pedestal, emerged from the floor's networked ocean of nanobots on an as-needed basis. The ceiling 10 feet overhead formed the floor of the utilitarian upper deck. The vertical walls of the main floor tied into the pointed dome that formed the walls and ceiling of that top level. From behind the control panel, Richard looked up at the 10-foot ceiling, and then back at the shrouded body behind him. It seemed like a lifetime had passed in the hours since Jake, Victor, and he had stood under the upper deck's uni-translucent dome watching the moon's desolate surface scroll under the turtle. When all hell had broken loose, they had been on an orientation flight around the moon. Richard had taken them to its far side to demonstrate the turtle's speed and capabilities. Having watched Earth pass peacefully behind the moon's limb, they'd had no idea that when next they saw the planet, an alien armada would be bearing down on it, preparing to launch an apocalyptic attack. Richard stared at Lieutenant Croft's shrouded body. "Sorry I was such an asshole, Victor." Thrust into combat, nervous almost to the point of cowardice, the young lieutenant proved courageous in the end. During the final battle, Victor had saved Richard from certain death and sacrificed his own in the process. Captain Allison shook his head. "Thanks, asshole. I treat you like shit and you go and save my life." Colorful lights cascaded through the turtle's interior, drawing Richard's attention outside. He sighed and turned back to the control panel. Below, the brilliant Las Vegas Strip passed under the ship. Ahead, the base's runway complex slid into view. "Nellis Tower, Nellis 1 has the landing zone in sight. I'll be on the ground in about 5 seconds. Roger, Turtle 1. I still don't have you on radar or visual. Wait. Holy shit." The controller cut out mid-word. Then he returned. Turtle 1, you're clear to land." Illuminated by myriad vehicles and portable light towers, the designated section of ramp glowed as if a midsummer sun shone on it. Richard cast a final glance at his fallen comrade. He nodded toward the front. "There's your welcoming party, Lieutenant." Extending the landing gear, the captain flared the ship and executed a perfect touchdown in front of the airmen and their small fleet of support vehicles. Through the view wall, he recognized several of the personnel from the Area 51 underground hangar facility that usually housed the turtle. "Nellis Tower, thanks for your assistance. I'll see you on the way back out." "Roger," replied the tower controller in an awed voice. Richard shut down the turtle's systems. With a final glance at Victor's shrouded body, he walked to the airlock. Stepping in, he heard the soft, static noise accompanying the closing of the door behind him. After the airlock had lowered him into the belly with no apparent movement, a rectangular section of the exterior skin vaporized with the same sound. Richard squinted into the flickering, multicolored, blinding light streaming into the small space. Beyond the opening, two security police sergeants in full-dress uniform waited with an ambulance stretcher. At its center sat a folded U.S. flag. In the moments he'd taken to shut down the turtle, the remaining personnel had fallen into two groups facing each other across a 5-foot-wide path that led from the ship's airlock to the waiting ambulance. Each officer, sergeant, and airman stood at rigid attention. One of the police sergeants commanded, "Present! Arms!" In unison, the gathered military personnel saluted. Standing at attention, Richard returned the salute. "At ease." They lowered their hands. However, everybody remained at attention. Understanding, Richard waved the two SP sergeants forward, gesturing into the airlock. "This way, sergeants." Breaking from their rigid posture, they grabbed the stretcher and rolled it into the turtle. Richard followed them. A few seconds later, now on the turtle's main deck, the sergeants stepped to the side of the lieutenant's body. After staring at the seamless silver foil that enshrouded the young lieutenant, the two men exchanged concerned glances. Then they gave Richard a questioning look. "It's pretty thin foil, sir," said the one to Richard's right. "It's not going to hold." "It'll hold," Richard said flatly. He took the folded flag off of the litter. "Is it Mylar, sir?" "Something like that," he said impatiently. The medics exchanged glances again. Finally, they bent over and grabbed the corners of the nanobot-formed body bag. After a tentative pull had proved it wouldn't tear, the sergeants lifted Victor over the stretcher. Then they gently lowered him into the U.S. Air Force standard-issue body bag resting on its white sheets. With respectful reverence, the sergeant by the lieutenant's foot began zipping the black body bag closed. Richard and the other sergeant saluted. As the zipper neared the end of its travel, something moved inside the bag. Both of the medics jumped back. The nanobots that had formed the foil shroud streamed through the narrow, puckered opening at the top of the zipper. Undulating like a mercurial python, the silvery snake flowed back into the floor's nanobot matrix. Both sergeants stared wide-eyed as the bots merged with the floor. Richard lowered his salute and handed the mute men the flag. Following his lead, both snapped out of their trances. After zipping the bag closed, the sergeants stood at attention. With military precision, they folded the U.S. flag. Standing at opposite ends of the litter, they held Old Glory taut, a foot over Victor's body. Richard saluted again. "Thank you for your sacrifice, Lieutenant. Hell, the whole world owes you a great debt." As if in slow motion, the flag drifted down. A moment later, it covered the entire body bag. The two security police officers adjusted it until the red and white stripes ran straight and the corners presented square angles. After a silent pause, the medics rolled the ambulance stretcher into the airlock. Richard joined them. A few seconds later, they exited the ship. As they emerged into the stark lights, someone yelled, "Present arms!" Again, the rigid right hand of every person snapped to their brows. In respectful silence, the officers and airmen held the salute as the two sergeants rolled Victor's flag-draped corpse down the makeshift aisle. Standing in the ship's opening, Richard held his salute until the sergeants pushed the stretcher into the back of the waiting ambulance and closed the doors. The vehicle pulled away from the formation. A captain near the front shouted, "Order! Arms!" Snapping their right hands back to their sides, each personnel returned to attention. Then the officer commanded, "Forward! Face!" Simultaneously, the half to Richard's right executed a left face, while the group on his left executed a right face. "Present arms!" shouted the officer that stood opposite Richard. With an audible crack, 100 impeccably rendered salutes regarded Captain Richard Allison. Not a single dry eye peered from the assembled personnel. Few actually knew the lieutenant, but all of them obviously took his loss hard. Richard realized the sight of Victor's flag-draped corpse served as a symbol for everything the Zoxith had taken that day. The untold millions of vaporized bodies, their emptied garments strewn about population centers across the globe. The image wavered as Richard shed silent tears. Standing at attention, he returned their salute. Making a point to look each airman and officer in the eye, Richard nodded at those he knew. Behind their tears, he saw another emotion take root. With apparent pride and even admiration, every man and woman looked directly at him. Their veneration made him uncomfortable. He didn't deserve it. Richard lowered his hand, self-consciously looking down. The same officer said, "Order! Arms!" Richard looked up and said, "At ease." This time, everyone relaxed. He stepped from the airlock, and the organized assemblage collapsed on him, the swarm of cheering men and women nearly tackling him. "What the hell?" "You don't know, sir?" said a sergeant from his Area 51 ground crew, his voice barely audible over the din. "Know what?" "You're a worldwide hero," he said, pounding Richard's shoulder. "All three of you. Well, they don't know your names yet, but it's all over the news." "I'm no hero," Richard said softly. He shook his head. "Wait, how could the news networks know anything about what we did? What did you hear?" "We didn't hear it, sir. We saw it. An observatory on the East Coast was piping a live feed from its telescope to the news channels." He slapped Richard on the back. "It was a little blurry, but the moment we saw something slide from behind that enemy ship, we knew it was the turtle. Those bastards were still firing their lasers, but you guys slipped right in. You should have heard the cheers. After a while, the lasers stopped, but we were on pins and needles until we saw you pull away an hour later." The tech sergeant slapped Richard's shoulder again. "Great job, sir." In stunned silence, Richard absorbed the sergeant's words. He scanned the crowd, studying their proud, eager faces. Uncomfortable, he looked at the sergeant and shook his head. "I'm no hero," Richard repeated softly. After a moment, he sighed and winked at the tech sergeant. "Fuck it. Let's get this show on the road." A smile chased away the sergeant's uneasy look. Richard raised his voice. "We've got a lot of work to do, folks. Let's get this thing loaded up." The group's excited chatter ceased, and everyone nodded soberly. Richard pointed at the turtle. "I want the entire top floor filled with supplies." He turned to Airman Johansson, the team's medical specialist. "Make sure we have a full complement of med supplies. Plan to support at least 100 personnel for 2 weeks. That should be enough for now." The airman nodded. Saluting smartly, he turned and departed. Richard addressed the sergeant in charge of logistical support. "Load up enough food and miscellaneous supplies for the same number." The sergeant snapped a quick salute and headed off with his subordinates in tow. The remaining personnel constituted Turtle ground support. Richard turned and addressed them en masse. "Well, folks, you guys know your jobs." He reached over and patted the dark, light-absorbing skin. "Run your diagnostics. Make sure our baby is ready for the next flight. And make sure all of our little nanobots are happy. I'm heading upstairs to get out of this." He gestured at his spacesuit and cocked an eyebrow. "I'm going to change back into my flight suit, so unless you want an eyeful, I suggest you wait to check that floor until after I come down." "Can we go a little faster, sir?" Captain Jake Giard said. "I'm trying to look non-threatening," Colonel Newcastle said. "I know the carrier is unmanned, but it might have a fail-safe defense system." Jake nodded. "Fair enough." He had seen the ship's lasers in action. He was in no hurry to have his body reduced to its constituent atoms. Looking for a way to board the Galactic Guardian, he and the colonel continued to work their way aft. The carrier's starfighters had deployed from that area. As they approached the stern of the mammoth ship, Colonel Newcastle oriented the nose of the space fighter toward the ship's surface. The empty Argonian ship filled the fighter's forward field of view. Its aft end slid into view overhead. "Figured I'd give us a better view of its skin. Maybe we'll spot an access hatch. How are you doing back there?" "Actually, sir, I'm getting a bit nervous. I'm not sure that pointing our guns into the carrier's center of mass is in spirit with the whole looking non-threatening thing." Jake tried to shift his position. "Otherwise, aside from not being able to feel my legs, I'm not too bad." "Oh, shit," Newcastle said. He pushed the fighter's nose away from the carrier. Now the ship's black skin scrolled overhead with the fighter's nose pointing in the direction of flight. Jake managed to smile. Hopefully somebody left a door open for us. Once we find it, I'm sure there'll be plenty of legroom in there. He didn't even know if they could get aboard the Guardian, and if he did manage that small feat, he didn't know if it could remotely control the other vessels. However, as the fleet's largest ship, it seemed a good place to start. They didn't know if other galactic defense forces were inbound, much less additional enemy ships. The same unknowns had driven Jake to lead Richard and Victor on that last-ditch effort to defang the sculpted asteroid. After it had killed Lieutenant Croft, the enemy commander fled deeper into the vessel. Ultimately, Jake tracked down and killed the bastard, stopping its systematic destruction of the emptied Argonian ships and attaining a measure of revenge. Beyond the tragedy of its lost crew, the GDF fleet represented a crucial asset. If Earth's militaries could gain control of it, they might stand a chance against further Zoxith attacks. The colonel slapped Jake's jutting knee and pointed through the fighter's canopy. It looks like we're almost to the back of the ship. The long, thin carrier had a pointed bow and a wide stern, giving it a wedge-shaped aerodynamic appearance. Just like the turtle, the skin of the huge ship absorbed starlight, earthshine, and almost all of the sunshine that fell upon its surface. The effect gave the impression they were flying over a hole in space. However, a new, closer horizon now appeared ahead. In the direction of flight, more stars became visible as the squared-off stern began to slide into view. As Newcastle rounded the back of the massive Argonian carrier, a huge opening came into view. "Yes," Jake said. As they continued drifting aft, a second opening appeared to the right of the first. The small portion of the interior that he could see at the oblique angle gave the impression of a vast hangar facility. Inside, Jake saw dozens of landing pads and several structures. Spread throughout, pieces of apparent ancillary equipment still sat waiting for the fighters to return. Jake pointed over the colonel's shoulder. "It looks like we should be able to fly right in." After a brief pause, he added, "As long as one of your hypothetical self-defense laser batteries doesn't vaporize us at the slightest misstep." Colonel Newcastle nodded. "We'll try not to look too menacing. Let's give it a shot." Decelerating, he maneuvered the space fighter toward the center of the left bay door. As they neared it, the hangar opening slowly expanded to fill the forward field of view, gradually eclipsing the stars visible around the ship. Just as Jake was about to say they were in, the ship bounced back. Aside from the visual change, he did not sense the course reversal. The fighter's gravity drive isolated their inertia, preventing them from perceiving the vector change. The small fighter's hull creaked in protest, but otherwise seemed undamaged. "I thought that might happen," Colonel Newcastle said. "The Argonians probably have a system in place that prevents non-Argonian equipment from entering." Jake nodded. While he had hoped for the best, he'd suspected the same thing. He looked down to the fighter's lower right. "I've got an idea." Pointing, he said, "The hangar floor extends outside of the force field. See? It forms a lip below us. I'll bet there's a gravity field generated on it." "Yeah, but how's that going to help?" Jake pointed to his chest. "I'm wearing an Argonian spacesuit. Hopefully it has IFF built into it," Jake said, referring to the U.S. military's ubiquitous identify friend or foe computer transceivers. They prevented friendly fire, most of the time. It was then that Jake noticed that laser cannons adorned all four corners of each bay door, all 8 of which appeared to be aimed at the space fighter. Not wanting to point, Jake said, Sir, I think your slow approach was a good idea. Take a look at the corners." "What Oh, shit." "Well," Jake said, "we're still alive. So far, so good." Newcastle nodded. "Hopefully their computer remembers that we were an ally during the battle." "From your lips to God's ears," Jake said. "Mind lifting the lid, sir?" Newcastle turned halfway toward Jake and gave him the fisheye again. "Are you sure about that, Captain?" Jake nodded. After a long pause, Colonel Newcastle nodded as well. Then he grabbed something off of the far panel. Take this." He passed a handheld radio back to Jake. "Keep it as a backup. It probably has greater range than your suit radio. Try to find a way to drop the hangar bay's force field. Otherwise, you're going to have to do this on your own." Taking the radio, Jake nodded. "Deploy your suit's helmet," Newcastle said. "I'm going to pump the air out." "Go ahead, sir. It activates automatically." Newcastle shrugged his shoulders. After donning his spacesuit helmet, he pressed a button. In spite of the assurance he'd given the colonel, Jake held his breath. A hiss superimposed over the popping in his ears. Then the clear dome of his helmet flowed into position like a reverse time-lapse video of melting ice. Jake released the breath. Then he stuck the radio to his right hip. The suit's intuitive nanobots held it like Velcro. It stuck next to the pistol he still carried. The empty shotgun he'd used to kill the Zox commander was on the turtle with Richard. All sound followed the atmosphere out of the cockpit. Newcastle's voice shattered the deafening silence as it blared over the suit-to-suit radio. "Well, son?" He paused, gesturing to the nearest laser turret. "Don't come crying to me if that thing zaps you into a pile of smoke and ash." Jake grinned sardonically. "Thanks, sir. I'll try to remember that." Colonel Newcastle's reflection smiled. Then the canopy shot open. Both Jake and the colonel twitched. Fortunately, the laser had not. "Son of a bitch," Newcastle said. "I really need to talk to the engineers about slowing that down a bit." Jake climbed over the colonel. Since the fighter had its own gravity well, Jake easily climbed out of the cockpit and onto the small craft's smooth titanium skin. As before, its internal gravity caused him to start sliding toward the edge. However, this time Jake didn't fight it. He let the slide take him over the precipice. When he reached it, the Argonian ship's gravity field took over. He landed firmly on his feet. Casting a wary eye at the nearest laser turret, Jake turned and gave the colonel a thumbs up. As the fighter's canopy lowered, Newcastle returned the gesture. Taking a moment to enjoy the view, Captain Giard nervously inched toward the ledge's rear edge. Standing as close as he dared, Jake braced himself against the fighter and craned his neck. Peering down, he looked at the Atlantic Ocean, 200 miles below his feet. As Jake had learned all too well, if he stepped from this stationary ledge, he'd fall straight down. A chill ran up his spine. His heart pounded out an echoing cacophony audible over his rasping breath. He shifted his gaze up to the top of the planet. Ahead of him, beyond the horizon, lay the North Pole. To his front left, the southern tip of the snow-covered island of Greenland cut a jagged white notch into the arcing blue horizon. On his lower left lay the east coast of North America. To his lower right, Spain, the Strait of Gibraltar, and North Africa finished the image. To his distant right, across a couple of 100,000 miles of space, the moon peeked from behind the back corner of the massive ship. "Any time now, Captain." Jake nodded and waved his free hand. His other still had a death grip on the edge of the fighter. After a cautious backward step, he released it. He was almost surprised that his fingers hadn't left indentations. Jake flexed blood back into them. Turning from the panorama, he walked toward the hangar's opening. As he approached the point where the force field had blocked the fighter, he extended two querying hands. Squinting his eyes, Jake spotted the membrane. Barely perceptible, a thin, milky film stretched across the bay door. His gloved hands passed through it without resistance. Flickering electrical discharges formed a ring around each finger, and then his hands. In spite of the suit's protection, Jake felt a pressure differential across the plane of the force field. He pulled his hand out. Stepping back from the paper-thin membrane, he shook his head. Somehow the force field held back the massive atmospheric pressure applied across its significant surface area without deforming. It was a perfectly flat plane. Holding his hand at eye level, he studied its metallic covering. It looked normal. The force field hadn't damaged his spacesuit. "My hands passed through the force field. There's atmosphere on the other side," Jake said over the radio. "Now's as good a time as any. I'm going to try to step through. Roger. Call me back from the other side." After a chuckle, he added, if it doesn't fry you to a cinder." Turning his back to the colonel, Jake waved. "Thanks again, sir." He faced the opening. After a brief pause, he took a deep breath. "Here goes nothing." Chapter 4. "Admiral, all ships report battle ready," said the Helm Warden's tactical officer. Admiral Ashtara Takama gave her a single nod, then returned his attention to the display. He studied the holographic rendering of his fleet and the rapidly approaching star system. He shook his head. There were too many damned unknowns. Sector 64 had gone dark, and now the Chuvarti system in Sector 19 had followed suit. "I hate blindly flying into a potential battle," he said for the third time. In his Eon's virtual vision, Takama toggled Admiral Fediak's icon. "Any contact with your bio-half?" An hour earlier, the computer-based portion of the commander he'd sent to intercept the Zoxith fleet in Sector 64, Admiral Thoyd Fediak, had informed him of a loss of continuity. He reported they had been seconds from dropping into Earth space when the disconnect occurred. "Nothing yet, sir," computer-based Thoyd said. His synthetic voice had a panicked edge. Disconnected intelligences usually did. As a combat commander, Ashtara communed with disjointed personalities all too often. They always seemed on the verge of panic, as if the time separated from their organic id would lead to irreparable psychosis. Takama knew it wasn't an idle concern. Long-term, untethered parallel existence could create a permanent schizophrenic duality. It happened, and the longer the separation, the rougher the reconnect. Bonding with a fresh, tank-grown body was easier than re-emerging with a divergent copy. He'd seen relief in the virtual face of more than one computer-based personality when they'd discovered their bio-half had indeed died. The practice of placing copies of combat personnel into the network began for the obvious reasons. To prevent that duality, they had dedicated a percentage of each ship's nanoscale wormhole communication link to enable real-time galaxy-wide connections between network-based and organic-based IDs. Otherwise, the loss of continuity rendered one merely a copy. If a person's body died while connected to its computer-based self, his or her stream of consciousness continued without disruption. Their consciousness remained intact within the network. If someone died during a period of disconnection, the individual experienced true death. The portion of their id remaining within the network continued as a separate person. An Earth-based Argonian from the 1970s or 80s would ask, "Is it live or is it Memorex?" Computer-based Thoyd's virtual eyebrows hoisted higher. "I've consulted with my subordinates. None of them have heard from their bios either." Fediak's panicked tone matched his rendered face. "What do you think happened, Ashtara?" "Calm down, Thoyd," Takama said. He'd known the man for over a century. Ashtara found Thoyd's uncharacteristic trepidation disconcerting, corrosive to his own calm. "I'm sure there is a reasonable explanation," Takama said. "You were still in parallel space. The Zox don't have anything that could touch you there." Admiral Fediak's avatar looked ready to say more, but Takama held up a virtual hand. "Thoyd, I have to go. We're approaching Chuvarti. Hang in there, friend. I'll let you know as soon as I hear anything." Thoyd nodded. Ashtara closed the connection. He turned to the communications officer. "Have we received any further distress calls from the Chuvarti system?" "No, sir. Nothing since the initial call. It's fortunate we were so close to Sector 19. Takama nodded, but he knew fortune had nothing to do with it. The intel he'd received placed half of Thrax's fleet in this sector, while the other half had deployed to the far side of the galaxy, to remote Sector 64. He had a nagging feeling there was more to this situation than met the eye. "Place all battle cruisers on a weapons-free status," ordered Takama. "All fighter squadrons are to launch as soon as we drop out of parallel space. If we're flying into a trap, I want the Zoxith to regret it." He studied the fisheye lens of the squeezed starfield in front of the formation. The fleet's superluminal speed compressed all light from the front half of the visible universe into a sphere Takama could cover with a hand held at arm's length. The light of the stars to aft traveled too slowly to catch up with the ship, rendering a virtual black hole of the rest of the universe. Brightened at its center due to the Doppler-shifted starlight, the fisheye faded at its edges, shifting through the visible spectrum like a round rainbow, finally dwindling to red and infrared at its periphery. A tiny, bright blue point at the fisheye's center, the planet Chuvardi, grew into a discernible sphere as the fleet closed. The navigation officer broke the silence. "Normal space in 3, 2..." The undersized Zoxith crew member nervously peered at Thrax from behind the communications console, unease evident in the way his dark green, horn-shaped ears folded flat against his scaled skull. The razor-sharp talons of Lord Thrax's right hand curled into a fist. "What is it?" he roared. That a communications officer cowered before him came as no surprise. After all, the pitiful excuse of a Zoxith had chosen a non-combatant position. But Thrax couldn't abide weakness in any form. "No response from Commodore Salith, my lord." With lithe fluidity, Lord Thrax's massive bulk exploded from the cool embrace of the carved black rock throne and flashed across the damp stone floor of the Tidor Droff Bridge. Sliding to a stop, he allowed the mottled gray-green scales of his forearm to graze the idiot's neck, grinning internally as the coward flinched away from a retaliatory blow that didn't land. Raising the forearm to eye level, Lord Thrax watched its black, razor-sharp dewclaw talon extend and retract, the underlying muscles of his huge arm rippling its sheath of dark scales. Shifting his focus beyond the claw's gleaming sable edge, he glared at the visibly shaken officer. In spite of his evident unease at the Lord's proximity, the officer held his ground and repeated his report. "Commodore Salith has not replied to our calls." He swallowed hard. "My lord." At least the fool stood his ground. Had he not, Thrax would have used his dewclaw talon to relieve the junior officer's shoulders from the burden of carrying the idiot's head. After a moment of silent menace, Thrax retracted the talon and returned to his high-backed black cathedra. Dropping his enormous bulk into the dark throne, he said, "This is our day. I will deal with Commodore Salith later." To the right of Lord Thrax, his longtime friend and confidant Raja Fasir growled. The deep rumble rattled through the wizened warrior's massive chest. Turning his scarred face to Thrax, the Raja grinned. However, the expression didn't reach his soul eye. In the mixed tones of the Zox language, Fasir's voice rumbled and screeched as he whispered, "I don't trust Salith. Too eager to ascend, that one." Thrax nodded. "His silence concerns me as well." The Raja's smile evaporated. "I told you he thought his time had come. I fear he has overreached, my lord." Looking forward, he said, "You should have let me take the hatchling down a notch when I offered." Nodding again, Lord Thrax turned from Fasir and scanned the bridge. Images of his 15 dreadnoughts filled monitors across the bridge of the Tidor Droff. The first 14 asteroidal vessels had already completed their attack. Displayed on monitors across the cavernous room, they lifted from the planet, hammering vertically through the thinning atmosphere, a roiling trail of superheated plasma in their wake. Thrax turned his attention to the primary display. The 15th dreadnought hovered over the last target, blocking most of the Argonian settlement from view. As with the Tidor Droff, the dreadnought's intimidating bulk came from its collection of massive ferrite asteroids held together by enormous trusses and ironworks. Matching the rest of the fleet's ships, a grinning face glared from the vessel. Chiseled into the likeness of a Zoxith forebearer, an arena-sized head with an Argonian skull clenched in its jaw formed the dreadnought's bridge. Modified to provide living space and moist, breathable air, the multi-level interior of the giant hollowed-out iron boulders felt like the homeworld. The Zoxiformed environment rendered the decks of the asteroid an adequate simile of Zoxa's huge caves and humid atmosphere. Thrax's steel-reinforced talons scratched longingly at the wet floor. Its slimy surface reminded him of home. Studying the layer of green algae covering the cathedra's armrest, he thought of all the blood spilled in the fruitless war with the Argonians. After the loss of his wife and son, a loss that Thrax blamed on Admiral Takama, he had sworn to avenge them. Even when the High Council had ordered him to withdraw back into Zoxith space, he'd struck at the heart of the enemy. But the GDF quickly reversed his early victories. Star systems started falling back into enemy hands. However, in spite of the loss of all but the last 32 dreadnoughts, victory now lay within Thrax's reach. As the first phase of the two-pronged attack drew to a close, the Zox dreadnought that currently dominated the image presented on the primary display prepared to deal the final death blow to this colony. The events to follow should bring the Argonians to their scrawny knees. All Zoxith would soon be home, especially if Salith had realized the same level of success in Earth space as Thrax anticipated in Chuvardes. The Lord cast a sideways glance at his old friend. As if reading his mind, the Raja said, "I hope the hatchling didn't squander his opportunity." Through Fasir's words, Thrax saw something disturbing flicker across the warrior's face. It almost looked like hope. "We should fall back, my lord." Thrax froze. "What?" The Raja pointed at the main display. "We're all but finished with this world, my lord. The Argonians may have discovered a defense for this weapon." Recovering, Thrax laughed. "If I didn't know you better, old friend, I'd think you afraid." The Raja bristled at the Lord's suggestion, his ears standing fully erect. Thrax raised a hand. "Calm yourself, my friend. You're a wise warrior. However, we have come too far to stop now." Fasir's ears lowered a shade, but he continued to glare at Thrax. "The coordinated timing of our and Salith's attacks, as well as the measures we took to suppress communications in both systems, have made it impossible for the GDF to formulate a defense against this weapon. The Galactic Defense Forces should be here soon. I guarantee you, Takama knows nothing." "See for yourself," Thrax said as he gestured at the ships portrayed across the bridge's video displays. "Even if Salith attacked too soon, even if he failed, the Argonians in this sector do not know of our weapon." The thought of the coming battle had Thrax's salivary glands churning. The pointed tip of the Lord's black tongue dabbed frenetically at his dripping silver fangs. His eyes twitched from the dreadnought to the tactical display. Standing, Thrax raised his voice. "Speaking of the Seraph, where is Takama?" "No sign yet, my lord," replied another officer. "I hope he gets here soon. I wouldn't want him to miss out on all this," Thrax said with a broad, sweeping gesture toward the main display. "Lord Thrax, we're picking up a new distress call from the surface." "Is it a subspace signal?" "No, my lord. We're still jamming all subspace communications," replied the nervous officer. Lowering his voice, Thrax turned to the Raja. "The GDF won't know what happened until it's too late," he said through a toothy grin. He returned his glare to the undersized communications officer. "So where is the signal coming from?" "It is an in-system video message, my lord." Thrax's grin widened, and he sat up on the rocky ledge of his throne. "Show me." On the main display, the hovering Zoxith dreadnought disappeared. The image of a disgusting Argonian female with her whining cubs clutching at her skinny legs filled the monitor. The high-pitched whine of the breeder and her whelps abraded his nerves. "What is it saying?" he growled at the communications officer. After a nervous twitch, the officer entered a couple of commands into his console, and a deep, melodious Zoxith translation replaced the aberrant, squeaky Argonian voice. "Oh, my gods! The Zoxith ship is overhead now." Thrax smiled. "Put this Argonian bitch and her cubs out of their misery," he said coldly. The tactical officer nodded and forwarded the command. The image of the ship hovering over the settlement returned to the display. With a brilliant flash, the glorious cleansing light wave of the genetic disruptor erupted from the dreadnought's bridge. The sphere of stars ahead of Takama's ship blossomed 2 seconds early. Like a sparkling circular waterfall streaming from the orb's center, A perfectly symmetrical wave of red-shifted stars expanded across the black dome of space. The racing front quickly encircled the GDF formation. In its diminishing wake, the wave deposited its bounty of stars in their normal positions and usual colors as no longer outrunning light. The fleet fell into regular space before the scheduled time. 1-0, the navigation officer said, finishing his countdown with a confused tone. Multiple icons within Takama's virtual vision shifted to red, half of his awareness falling away as if a laser had cleaved his soul. The expressions crossing the faces of the bridge's complement of officers mirrored Takama's feelings. While the men likely thought it a temporary disconnect, the Admiral knew better. Whatever had knocked them out of parallel space had also closed their communications wormhole. "Report," Takama ordered as he evaluated the data streaming from his few still-active Eon channels. "All fighters away," Tactical announced through a bewildered tone. Takama looked at her and shook his head. The information pumped into his Eon interface showed that local space was empty. Nothing that could threaten his ship was in the area. "Recall them. We dropped out of parallel space early. We're still tens of light seconds out. There's no sense in our fighter pilots spending the next hour in their cockpits." "I don't understand, sir. Why don't we just short-jump our way in from here?" Considering the loss of communication with Fadyak in Sector 64, Takama already knew the answer, but he pointed to his navigation officer. "Tell her." The officer nodded. "There's a Zoxith fleet here, all right. But now I know why we haven't received calls. Someone dropped a subspace picket across the sector. That's why we've lost Omninet connection as well." The nav officer's face twisted with confusion. Turning to Takama, he said, "But, sir, that doesn't make sense. Why would we place a disruptor field across the system?" Takama shook his head. "I assure you we did not." The subordinate pointed through the view wall. "It couldn't have been the Zoxes. They don't have that kind of technology." "Apparently they do now," Takama said. "But the biggest question is why would they use it here?" From behind the tactical console, the other officer said, "If they've gained the tech, it's a fairly standard ploy." Cutting her off, Takama pointed at the helmsman. "No, he was right the first time. It doesn't make sense. Once the Zoxith fleet knew they had a big enough head start, they made no secret of their destination. Hell, a first-year academy student could have tracked them here. So why wouldn't they want us to see their attack on our outpost? With that much lead time, they could have finished the attack and jumped back out of the system before we arrived. As we blazed toward the system at top parallel space speed, still unable to intervene, why wouldn't they want us to receive subspace messages from colonists begging for our help?" Through narrowing eyes, Takama studied the distant planet. "What are you up to, Thraxed?" Chapter 5. The pressure differential made stepping through the barrier feel like slipping into a vertical pool of water. First, Jake's right arm and his left leg penetrated the force field. Then his visored face pressed into its surface, the flickering light of the accompanying static discharges glowing red through his closed lids. Finally, the rest of his body passed through the membrane. He'd made it. He was inside. Jake stopped. The bay's illumination appeared brighter in here than it had through the force field. More light than he'd expected burned through his squinting and blinking eyes. Jake twitched as the suit's helmet retracted into the neck ring with startling suddenness. Realizing he'd been holding his breath, he tentatively sipped the air. Other than a faint ozone odor, it smelled and tasted normal. His eyes slowly adjusted to the increased luminosity. Jake looked back at the hangar's force field. It must limit the amount of interior energy allowed to bleed into space. That's why it had looked darker in here from out there. The opening through which Jake had passed was roughly 60 feet tall by 90 feet wide, almost 8 stories overhead. The entire surface of the ceiling beyond the bay door glowed, providing the hangar's illumination. Where ceiling met wall 60 feet to his left or port, a gently curving radius joined the perpendicular surfaces. The ceiling's glow faded out halfway through the transition. Beneath it, a collection of white rectangular panels with their short ends on top and bottom like vertically oriented bricks formed the left wall. A thin gap between each panel created a grid pattern that foreshortened like railroad tracks as they continued to the back of the huge hangar. The back wall appeared to be about 2 football fields away, deeper into the ship. A path or taxiway cut through the center of the wide hangar, apparent landing decks lining both sides all the way to the back. Several pieces of equipment sat next to many of the pads. Spacecraft of varying designs remained on some of them. Jake didn't see exits along either of the side walls. Focusing his attention on the far end, he saw something that might be a door. He turned and looked back through the rear hangar opening. Silhouetted against Earth, Newcastle's fighter now hovered 200 yards aft of the carrier. "I'm in, sir," Jake said. When Newcastle didn't respond to the suit radio, Jake pulled the handheld radio from his hip. He pressed the side-mounted transmit key. "How do you read me on this radio, sir?" "Not very well, Captain," the colonel replied, his voice distant, barely discernible above the radio's background static. "I copied all, but be advised, you're coming in extremely weak." "Got you the same, sir." Jake pointed behind him. "I think there's an opening in the far wall." He scanned the perimeter of the large hangar door. "I don't see anything that looks like a control panel on this end. I'm going to head forward and see if I can find a way to let you in here." "Keep me up to date," Newcastle said. "In the meantime, I'm trying to buy us some time. My pilots are using their ships to marshal the farthest fighters. Like a bunch of space cowboys trying to regroup a herd, they're gently bumping and pushing them back toward the formation," he said, emphasizing gently. Jake keyed the radio and waved his left arm. "Roger, sir, good idea. I'll try to keep you up to date, but I doubt the radio signal will get any better. The back wall is quite a way into the ship. What are your orders if I don't find anything there?" "Continue your search. If you haven't found anything within an hour, return to the hangar and check in." He snapped a quick salute. "Yes, sir." Turning, Jake started jogging toward the back and stumbled over something on the floor. Looking down, he stared into the face of an empty spacesuit. He'd missed it earlier. The floor was the same milky, metallic color as the garment. Jake looked around and spotted several additional articles haphazardly strewn about the expansive hangar. Some were gathered around the pieces of equipment, while others appeared to have been cut down mid-step while crossing the hangar. Looking at the poignant reminder of the day's tragic losses, Jake shook his head. "Fuck!" An involuntary shudder ran through him. Dragging his eyes from the faceless victim, he resumed his trek to the back of the hangar. En route, he passed the few remaining ships. The first couple looked like the sleek fighter versions of the Turtle that had encircled the enemy fleet before the battle. However, the farthest ship was much bigger. Near the back of the hangar, it was easily 50 feet tall by 65 feet wide and 3 times that lengthwise. All of them had that liquid metal-smooth, light-absorbing skin that he'd first seen on the Turtle. A faint sound froze Jake in his tracks. Had that been a voice? Then it returned. No longer masked by the sound of his shuffling feet, he clearly heard the words this time. "Heed to the Eon maintenance facility for Eon replacement." Jake snapped his head in the direction from which the voice had issued. It sounded like a woman was calling to him. Barely perceptible, speaking in the Argonian language, it came from somewhere near his destination. He was still about 150 feet from the now obvious opening. His spirits rose. However, as Jake drew closer, the voice repeated. "Your Eon is out of service. Please proceed to Eon maintenance for Eon replacement." An automated message. It obviously wasn't intended for him. Shit. Jake shook his head and continued toward the rear door. A pointed arch framed its tall opening. In the apparent corridor beyond, antiqued bronze surfaces contrasted against the hangar's bright white walls. Pulsing rhythmically, a pair of glowing green strips streamed down its dark floor, flowing like a river away from Jake. Louder and more insistent, the automated voice returned. "Your Eon is out of service. Please follow the marker lights to Eon maintenance for Eon replacement." Whatever an Eon is, Jake responded in Argonian. "I've got other things to take care of right now, like interfacing with that damn force field." He scanned the area around the opening. Nothing looked like a control console. Remembering the turtle's nanobots, he realized he probably wouldn't be able to see it. Likely the controls didn't exist until he needed. "How do I tell this ship what I need?" The computer voice answered. "You will be unable to interface with ship systems until your Eon is functional. Please follow the marker lights to the Eon maintenance facility for Eon replacement." After a shocked pause, Jake whispered, "Okay, you have my attention now." He stared into the incredibly long hallway. Like railroad tracks extended to the horizon, its parallel lines and flashing floor lights extended so deep into the ship that they appeared to converge. He turned to look outside and toggled the radio. "Vampire 6, I may have found a way to interface with the force field, but I'll have to head deeper into the ship." Colonel Newcastle's voice came through extremely broken and barely legible. "Roger, Cap. You're coming even weaker now. Copy that. Going deeper. If you haven't gained access within our return, check in. Over." "Roger, sir. Captain's yard out." Releasing the transmit key, Jake studied the radio for a moment, hoping that the colonel had heard him. Shifting his gaze to the distant fighter beyond the force field, he saw it wag left and right. Then it drifted back from the opening and departed, probably to help with the herding efforts. Now completely alone in the ghost ship, Jake felt another chill creep down his spine. He turned back to the massive hallway's arched opening. "Your Eon is out of service. Please follow the marker lights to Eon maintenance for Eon replacement," the computer repeated, emphasizing please with almost human impatience. Jake resisted the urge to query the computer-animated voice directly, afraid it might ask its own questions, like, "Who are you and what the hell are you doing on this ship?" Instead, he muttered, I'm going. After a brief hesitation, he shook off the chill and stepped through the opening. The apex of the bronze-pointed arch towered 45 feet over the 12-foot-wide doorway. Stepping through brought Jake into a 20-foot-wide by 60-foot-tall passageway, the graceful beauty of its architecture reminiscent of a Gothic European cathedral. Fluted casings surrounded the opening. A crisscross pattern of the same design continued the pointed arch motif down the ceiling of the long hall. To the limit of Jake's vision, the corridor continued unchanged, tapering to a point like a railroad track, its parallel lines appearing to converge in the distance. Starting a few yards from where he stood and continuing as far as he could see, ornately trimmed openings periodically interrupted the lines of the left and right walls. The moving lights that apparently led to the Eon maintenance facility seemed to run to the distant end of the passageway. "Holy crap," Jake whispered as he considered the length of the ship. Shaking his head, he began jogging, following the light. As he passed openings, he stole glances into the rooms beyond, wishing he had time to study each. Jake caught glimpses of massive halls, some exceeding the size and grandeur of the Vatican's St. Peter's Basilica. In another room, a massive terrarium featured alien vegetation growing from niches positioned high and low, some even issuing from the ceiling. The sound of falling water accompanied screeches and chirps of unseen fauna, although Jake did glimpse one leathery winged animal gliding amongst the flora. As room by room scrolled past, he half expected Argonian troops to pop out and ask what he was doing on their ship. As he started to wonder if the hallway ran the entire length of the vessel, the passage of openings accelerated at a pace out of sync with his jog. Jake stopped running, but the rooms continued zipping by him as if the floor moved under his feet, or at least the strip upon which he stood. He saw no conveyor, no seam or edge, although the floor's perfectly smooth and featureless surface rendered movement, or lack thereof, indiscernible. Knowing the vast length of the ship, he resolved himself to be drawn into its depths. Adding his own speed to the trek, he began jogging again. Jake hoped it was a two-way street, otherwise he'd never make the 1-hour check-in. In the distance, he saw where the moving lights appeared to angle into an opening. Jake broke into a sprint for the distant room. Doorway after doorway zipped past on both sides, too fast to differentiate the contents of the rooms beyond. Deeper in the ship, it became obvious that some force, not a conveyor belt, propelled him down the corridor. Jake dodged motionless uniforms and alien apparel strewn along his path, the inane clutter still the only evidence of the day's tragedy. Many times he almost tripped as he negotiated areas where the weapon's awful effect had vaporized large groups. More than once he had to peel garments from his lower legs. Quickly closing the gap, he slid to a stop in front of the doorway through which the lights disappeared. The virtual conveyor halted as well. Jake stood staring into the opening, hopes dashed against the vision of another long corridor. Crap! Shaking his head, Jake looked back in the direction from which he'd come. The vast distance concealed the bright hangar at the passageway's far end. Jake couldn't even see a white dot where the door had been. Sighing, he turned, his eyes following the flowing lines into the perpendicular hall where a new detail drew his attention. While it appeared that the hallway continued to the far right side of the ship, the lights didn't reach that end. Amidship, they disappeared. "Your Eon is out of service," the obviously impatient computer repeated. Jake tried to detect its source, but the feminine voice seemed to come from everywhere. "Please follow the marker lights to Eon maintenance for Eon replacement." "I'm going," he said, resuming his jog. In spite of the exertion and the comfortable temperature of the air, a chill ran through Jake as he dodged another pile of empty clothes. Again, he abandoned his controlled jog for a sprint. Assisted across the ship's narrower width by the resumed conveyance force, he quickly closed the gap. Ahead, the lights turned left into another opening. Approaching it, Jake reached out for the near side of the doorway, using its fluted trim to brace himself. Releasing it, he slid to a stop in the center of the opening. He stared into the maw of an empty vertical shaft. The sight generated a foreboding déjà vu. Even without a damaged car partially obscuring its door, the elevator shaft reminded Jake of the one they had used to access the enemy's bridge. Suppressing the dread that threatened to freeze him in his tracks, Jake stepped into the shaft. Unlike its Zoxith analog, this one had normal gravity. Confused, Jake looked around. Then, an invisible force identical to the one in the turtle gripped his lower extremities and lifted him. Accelerating upward, he soon flew in formation with the flowing lights. The ceiling rapidly approached. Just before he slammed into its solid surface, the metallic panel evaporated. Passing through the opening, he emerged into an empty room. The ceiling-turned floor rematerialized, and Jake gently landed on its reconstituted surface. Looking up from his space-suited feet, Jake whistled his relief. The room's white walls softly glowed. Overhead, the gently arched ceiling formed a flat dome. Again, the sound of static filled his ears. Worried the floor was dissolving under his feet, Jake leaped to the side, but the sound continued from behind him. He spun around in time to see a table and control panel manifest out of the floor. "Gotta love those nanobots," Jake said as he stepped up to the pedestal. Multiple arcane controls covered its concave surface. However, one glowed and pulsed with the same color and frequency as the lights that had led him to the room. An Argonian word sat at its base. "Activate." With no other apparent options, he haltingly reached for the control. "Here goes nothing." After a slight hesitation, he toggled it. Unexpectedly lifting Jake off his feet, an invisible force cocooned his entire body and propelled him across the empty room. Rotating him into a prone position, it drew his rigid body toward the new table. He futilely struggled to free himself from its iron grip. With mounting horror, Jake felt consciousness slipping from his grasp. "Oh my God," he began, but never finished. The black, velvet-lined abyss of unconsciousness wrapped its icy fingers around Jake and sucked him into its cold embrace. Chapter 6. Red light flooded the otherwise dark, dank bridge. "Lord Thrax, I have multiple targets exiting parallel space," shouted the communications officer. After a pause, he looked up, eyes burning with excitement. "It's the Helm Warden and fleet, and there's still 10 standard units out, my lord." "Just as I planned. Perfect timing and distance. The forebearers smile upon us," proclaimed Thraxed. "Order the fleet to form on the Tidor Drough in a standard defensive formation. I will have the head of any commander whose ship takes offensive action." "Yes, my lord," said the communications officer as he bowed deeply. Turning to the weapons officer, Thraxed growled, "What is the status of the fleet's gene weapons?" "Lord, 80% report recharged and ready for deployment." With a satisfactory nod, Thraxed returned his attention back to the view wall. The gene weapon's only pitfall was its long recharge time. He turned to Raja Fasir, the wizened Zoxith warrior posted on his right. "Thank the forebearers we staggered the attack to preserve our combat readiness. I hope Commodore Salith had the foresight to implement the same." The Raja nodded. "As do I, my lord." He drew a long, raspy breath. "The silence screaming from Sector 64 makes one wonder." Shaking his massive head, Thraxed growled through clenched silver fangs. "Don't make me come out to that forebearer-forsaken corner of the galaxy, Salith." "Lord, the Helm Warden is trying to hail us on an in-system frequency." Forgetting Salith for the moment, Thraxed grinned at Fasir. "So, they've noticed our subspace jammer." Raising his voice, he turned to the officer. "Do not reply. They are also trying to call the planet, my lord. Are they receiving a response?" The communications officer studied his station. After checking the entire electromagnetic spectrum, he said, "No, my lord." Sitting back in his black throne, Thraxed threw his head back and laughed. "The planet is dead, Takama. You're too late." His manic laughter echoed off the cavernous bridge's damp stone walls. "Admiral, the Zoxith are not responding to our hails," reported the communications officer. Takama stood from his force field chair. With his Eon, he accessed the bridge section's holo-generator. A new holographic rendering of the Chuvardi system coalesced in the air above the elevated bridge section. Following another Eon command, the point of view zoomed in, and the planet filled the display. Through the translucent rendering, Admiral Takama counted 16 enemy ships around the globe. Depicted in red, they streamed from various points above the planet. Scanning the group, he quickly picked out the Tidor Drough. "There you are, Thraxed." The rest of the enemy fleet moved to take up defensive positions around the bastard's ship, a standard Zoxith tactic when faced with overwhelming force. Glaring at the gathering enemy formation, Admiral Takama said, "What about the planet?" "Nothing, sir. Aside from a few automated beacons, I'm receiving no non-natural transmissions coming from the planet." "What? That's not possible. Zoxith never had subspace jamming capability. Even if they do now, jamming the relatively narrow band of subspace is one thing, but the Zoxith can't jam the entire electromagnetic spectrum." "No, sir, they're not jamming it. Aside from our fleet's internal radio chatter and the same from the Zoxith, there are no radio transmissions coming from the planet." Scanning the data streaming through his Eon, Takama came to the same conclusion. "Damn it, Fedyak," Takama whispered to himself. "I could really use a little intel here. This is shaping up just as your last report described." When he'd received a report that the Zoxith had split their forces, half to this sector and the other half to Sector 64, Admiral Takama had dispatched a task force headed by Admiral Thoyd Fedyak aboard the Helm Warden's sister ship, the Galactic Guardian. Simultaneously, he led the other half of the Galactic Defense Forces here. Now, the Galactic Guardian was a day late in reporting back. Their last report had drawn a very similar picture to what now lay before Takama. "Order the fighter squadrons to perform a standard encircling maneuver," Takama ordered through his mounting concern. "I want those dreadnoughts boxed in." "Yes, sir," responded Tactical. Takama monitored the commands as they flowed across the battle network. Manipulating the hologram, he zoomed in on Thrax's command ship. Shaking his head at the all-too-familiar sight of the Argonian skull clamped in the Zoxith's jaw, he panned down to Chuvardi's surface. Over the blue and brown planet's equator, it appeared Thrax had taken up station, hovering in space directly over the settlement's capital city. "Maneuver 2 battlecruisers between the enemy fleet and the city below," the Admiral ordered. "If this standoff turns hot, I want it protected from falling asteroids." Dakama felt his short hairs standing on end. Why are they dropping into a defensive position? They reserve that for dire fight-to-the-death circumstances. "Any response from the surface?" he asked again. "No, sir." "What areas of the planet have they attacked? The capital looks unscathed." "None, sir," replied the officer with a confused tone. "What?" Dakama asked with matching confusion as he watched the first fighter squadron begin to take up position around the enemy fleet. "That makes no— Admiral, we are receiving a transmission from the surface now," interrupted an officer from the communications console. "Thank the gods. Whoever it is, tell them I want this planet's governor on the horn now." The officer shifted uncomfortably. "There's a problem, sir." "What?" Dakama asked shortly. "It's better if you see for yourself, sir." Not waiting for the officer, Dakama snatched the data stream with his Eon and fed it directly into the holoprojector. Expecting to be addressing a military commander or planetary dignitary, he was shocked into silence by the image of a sobbing middle-aged man. "Who is this?" Dakama demanded. Looking like he might collapse, the weeping man only shook his head. "Son, please calm down," Dakama said. The stranger continued shaking his head. Between sobs, he whispered, "They're all dead." "What?" "Sir, please. This is Admiral Takama of the Galactic Defense Forces. Who is dead?" After the agonizingly long seconds it took the message to make the round trip, the man replied, "They're all dead." Between sobbing gasps, he added, "My family, my co-workers, everybody. They're all gone." Finally drawing himself up, he said the last part with conviction, anger apparently edging out the man's despair. "I'm very sorry to hear about your family. What's your name, sir? And what do you mean? How many died? Where did it happen?" As he waited for the light-speed limited signal, he again wondered how in the hell the Zoxith had gotten their talons on subspace jamming technology. Looking down, no longer weeping audibly, the man appeared to be trying to collect himself. In the holographic rendering, only his chin protruded from the parka hood's shadow. Steadied, the man's voice returned. "My name is Remulkin Thrameris." As his head slowly raised, the distant room's light chased away the hood's shadow. A hate-filled fire burned from the man's holographically rendered eyes. It was a look Admiral Takama knew too well. He took an involuntary step back as his sense of foreboding quadrupled. "Everybody is dead," he growled. "The whole goddamned planet has been wiped out. I think the only reason I'm still alive is because of this," he said with a gesture to the walls. "It's an uncharted polar science station. They didn't know I was here." Remulkin swayed mid-sentence. The sound of a tremendous explosion blasted from the display, and his holographic image rocked violently. "The Zoxith are firing on the planet's northern ice cap," shouted the female officer at the tactical station. The holographic man shook his head. "Guess they know I'm here now." "Do we have any ships close enough to cover him?" The tactical officer also shook her head. Takama saw small rocks falling through the image. Flinching, Remulkin placed an arm over his head. "Mr. Thrameris, I still don't understand," Takama shouted over the din of the Zoxith attack. "What you're saying doesn't make sense, son. There's no sign of attack anywhere on the planet." His sense of foreboding and frustration mounted as Takama waited for the reply. Shouting over another barrage of enemy fire, Remulkin said, "All I know was one moment my family was there. Then, after a blindingly bright flash, they were gone. Nothing left but their goddamned clothes lying empty on the floor, as if my wife and kids had been—" Thrameris paused. Takama saw and heard the man swallow down a sob. Then the holographic man's tortured eyes glared from the image. "As if they'd been Vaporized. Takama froze. It was only a second, but it was a second that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The crushing realization of the trap he had sailed into buckled his knees. A seat raised from the floor to catch him, but Takama pushed off it, leaping into action. Turning to his tactical comm, he shouted, "Fall back! Fall back! Fall back! All units are to break contact with the enemy!" Several officers stared back in bewilderment. "Now!" he screamed. Torn from their momentary paralysis, the officers dove into their assignments. Knowing that the light of the fighters he was looking at was several seconds old, Takama feared what may have already happened. He watched with mounting horror as the message took too long to propagate. The subspace jamming was limiting their communications to the speed of light. The farthest ships, the fighters surrounding the enemy formation, wouldn't get the message for a few more seconds. The sheer size of his fleet and the volume of space it occupied compounded the problem. Lasers wouldn't help either. They had the same speed of light limitation, couldn't get there any faster than the message, and at this range, they'd barely warm the hulls of the enemy ships. He could only hope the Zoxith would hesitate. Chapter 7. A tremendous roar echoed off the wet bridge's stone walls as an infuriated Thraxed blazed across the room, sparks flying from his armored talons. His arm flashed past the tactical officer's neck. Green mist sprayed the adjacent console. Frozen in place, the officer stood motionless. Turning his back to the fool, Thraxed glared through the view wall. A leisurely backward kick sent the dead officer's body sailing, while his severed head rolled off its shoulders and fell to the floor. Raising his forearm to eye level, Thraxed flicked out his black tongue. Licking green blood from his retracting talon, he said, "You failed." The offensive, squeaky voice of the betraying human echoed across the bridge. "Why am I still hearing that vile thing? Where is that signal coming from?" Thraxed roared. "It's coming from the planet's closest polar region," shouted an excited junior officer at the communications console. "I have it," replied a fierce, older voice from behind Thraxed. An energy beam shot from the Tidor Droff, striking the planet's ice cap. Thraxed turned back to find his old comrade and friend, Raja Fasir, had taken over the failed officer's weapons station. Raja fired again, and another energy beam sought out the damned Argonian. Thraxed nodded his thanks. "Send him to be with his gods, Fasir." Feeling the element of surprise slipping through his talons, Thraxed turned his attention outside. All of the enemy ships in the magnified view of the Helm Warden's arrayed fleet appeared to turn away in unison. The spread-out waves of enemy fighters occupied several light seconds of space. From the camera's point of view, the only way all of the ships could appear to turn simultaneously was in response to an order from the Helm Warden at the far side of the enemy formation. The image of their response and the radio signal that generated it both radiated through the formation and toward Thraxed at the speed of light. Each ship reversed course as soon as they received the order. While they turned in the staggered order caused by their distance from the Helm Warden and the speed of light limited transmission, the apparent image of them turning in unison could mean only one thing. "Takama knows." Spinning on Commander Fasir, he shouted, "Fire the gene weapon now!" Fasir hesitated. "Now!" Thraxed roared. Having reversed direction, the enemy squadrons blasted away from his gathered fleet. "Firing now, Lord," Fasir said finally. His grizzled hand slammed down on the weapon's activator. The glorious and cleansing energy wave burst from the Tidor Droff, quickly closing on and then enveloping the closest wave of the fleeing cowards. "Come on," Admiral Takama growled. In the magnified display, he watched the retreat order propagate through the waves of fighters at the agonizingly slow speed of light. Finally, it reached the formations closest to his command ship, 2nd and 3rd Squadrons. In sequence, they each instantly reversed direction. Thank the gods. An eternal second later, the fighters of 1st Squadron also received the order and zipped away from the enemy formation. Before Takama could take a breath, a brilliant white sphere of energy exploded from the center of the enemy fleet. Like the spreading maw of a ravenous monster, the ball of light expanded behind the silhouetted fighters of First Squadron. The sphere quickly filled the narrow field of view and became a wall of light. Takama issued an Eon command. The image zoomed out, and the rendered wave of light returned to its true spherical shape. Like a miniature supernova, the ball of energy continued to swell. An instant later, the monster swallowed First Squadron's fighters. Appetite unsated, it reached for the retreating ships of Second and Third Squadrons. Just as the sphere began to fill the expanded field of view as it closed on the tiny black silhouettes of the fighters, it faded to black. The holographic ships continued their mad dash for safety. However, behind them, the green renderings of First Squadron began to tumble across the void. In a dry croak, Takama whispered, "No." A roar echoed off the bridge's stone walls. Falling silent, Thraxed glared at the partial victory manifest across the main display. Like daggers jabbing into his ears, the Argonian's shrill voice again blared from the radio, shattering the silence. The Lord turned a burning red eye on his weapons officer and growled, "Send ancestral nemesis to vaporize that planet's pole." Turning from the officer, Thraxed dropped into his cathedra and gestured to Raja Fasir. As the warrior approached, Thraxed drew him close. "Now Takama knows our ability and plans." Pausing, he glared through the display. The Raja nodded. "Yes, my lord. They won't let another ship within firing range." Turning from the image of the fleeing enemy ships, Fasir's sole eye gave Thraxed a questioning look. "What are your orders, my lord?" "They won't let us get close," Thraxed said again. Suddenly his eyes widened. "Unless they don't see us coming." Turning his gaze from the Raja, Thraxed looked into the main display and glared at the magnified image of the Helm Warden where it hovered at the far side of the enemy formation. A menacing grin spread across his scaled lips. His black tongue flicked a thin thread of saliva that threatened to drip from a silver fang. For a moment it lingered, probing the tooth with nervous excitement. Finally, Lord Thraxed nodded. "Raise the Redeemer. I need to speak with her commander." Suddenly, Takama felt the familiar presence of his network-based half reestablish its link. At the same time, the Helm Warden's communications officer looked up with wide eyes. "Admiral, the enemy's disruptor field collapsed." Before he could digest the news or consider its ramifications, movement in the enemy formation snapped Takama out of his trance. "Admiral, a Zoxith dreadnought just peeled away from the main formation," reported the sensor officer. Looking up from his console, he added, "It's headed for the planet's pole. Get a fix on Remulkin's position. I'll be damned if I'm going to let that man die." Not waiting for a reply, he turned from the officer. Knowing the image of movement was a precious light second old, he activated a direct Eon connection with the commander of the battlecruiser closest to Javardi. When a holographic rendering of the captain materialized in front of him, Takama nodded to her. "Commander Bezel, micro-jump to the planet's pole and extract the scientist." Pausing, Takama cast a questioning look at his sensor officer. The man tapped a command into his holographic interface and nodded to the admiral. Ashtara turned back to the battlecruiser's captain. "His coordinates are in your nav computer." He pointed at the red hologram of the enemy ship. "Fire on them the instant you exit parallel space. Don't give the bastards a chance to fire that weapon." The commander would have no idea what that weapon was, but Takama was pleased when she didn't question his order. In spite of her evident confusion, the commander nodded. "Yes, Admiral." Bazil's holographic visage vaporized. At the same moment, the battlecruiser disappeared from the display, dropping from regular space. For a long second, it went nowhere. Then the image of it over the pole finally reached his sensors. Takama winced as white-hot light from a near source burned through the bridge like an erupting supernova. In spite of the V-Wall's auto-dark feature, the blinding light flooding the bridge washed all color from the room, casting everything in monochromatic white. While the image outside was too brilliant to differentiate, the hologram's sensor told the horrible truth. The rocky, red holographic rendering of a Zox dreadnought now lay buried in the smooth green lines of one of his battlecruisers. The two ships had melded perpendicularly across the centers like conjoined twins. In the computer-generated image, the Zoxith dreadnought's rocky protuberances jutted inelegantly from the sides of the sleek battlecruiser. Outside, the light faded, revealing the grinning, skull-crunching reptilian visage that constituted the dreadnought's bridge. Takama's eyes widened with sudden comprehension. "One of the bastards parallel jumped into our formation," he yelled. Parallel space travel allowed ships to pass through matter. Traveling in a parallel dimension, they passed through ordinary material with no interaction. Navigators chose jump entry and exit points based on their complete lack of matter. The enemy's uncharted jump had, upon exiting parallel space, inadvertently placed it in the same real space as the doomed battlecruiser, generating the massive, blindingly bright energy release. Watching various sections of each ship detonate along the conjoined lines, Takama finally recognized the threat posed by the enemy ship's proximity. "Retreat! Retreat! Retreat!" the Admiral screamed. Fearing that his slow recognition of the enemy's tactic may have cost him everything, Takama activated a fleet-wide Eon broadcast. "All commanders, self-execute fallback scenario Alpha, now!" Then he followed his own words. Through a direct Eon link, Takama activated the Helm Warden's parallel space drive. Simultaneously, a glowing sphere of energy exploded from the enemy ship. Takama doubled over in agony as the aberrant, expanding energy wave reached for his command ship. Remulkin Thramerus waited for a final blast or another flash of the enemy's light to take him to be with his family. So far, the science station's hollowed-out mountain peak had proved a durable bunker against the enemy's bombardment. However, the blasts were taking a toll. Many of the prefabricated ceiling and wall panels had been knocked loose. Rock fragments of various sizes and shapes littered the floor of the base. Looking nervously at the ceiling's recently exposed rock, Remulkin wormed toward his desk, seeking cover. Before he reached the sanctuary, a rock the size of a transport calved off the ceiling and crushed the desk. Blinking, Remulkin stared at the jutting corner of the boulder. Its jagged edge lay mere centimeters from his face. Coughing in the dust-filled air, he tore his eyes from the chunk of mountain. As he glanced warily at the ceiling, another blast shook the station. Fresh cave-ins elsewhere in the station shook the floor under his hands and knees. Suddenly, a new sound joined the cacophony. Like a giant monster grinding its teeth, creaking and groaning noises emanated from all of the science station's walls. To Remulkin's right, a prefabricated wall panel cracked and buckled, then shot violently from its position. With mounting horror, he watched as a spiderweb of cracks marched across the exposed rock wall. The station was collapsing. Discovering that he wasn't ready to die after all, Remulkin jumped to his feet. As he scrambled out of his room, a cloud of dust enveloped him. Another huge section of rock had broken off behind him. The rush of air and dust shoved him forward. With rocks raining down right and left, he ran toward the station's exit. Detecting his intentions, the Smart Floor's network of nanobots began to stream into his garments. His bib and parka gained a little more mass as each running footfall permitted a fresh wave of the microscopic robots to board his fleeing form. Still running, Remulkin was a meter from the exit when the station surrendered to the enemy's onslaught and the planet's gravity. Starting from the deepest section of the compound, the cascading collapse formed an atmospheric pressure wave that shot him through the exit like a cork fired from a pressurized bottle. He flew through the air. A snow dune cushioned his face-first landing. Remulkin rolled onto his back, brushing ice crystals from his eyes. Looking into the star-filled sky, he saw the silhouette of the enemy ship hovering over the crumbling mountain peak, the irregular lines of its asteroidal shape blotting out the backdrop of scintillating stars. A dense plume of rock dust radiated out from the mountain's collapse, obscuring the dreadnought. While the billowing cloud blocked his view of the ship, Remulkin knew it offered little protection from Zoxith's sensors. His rapid departure hadn't allowed sufficient time for the normal complement of nanobots to merge with his smart suit. The chill passing through his incomplete parka told him his body heat was leaking out. With nothing for Remulkin to hide behind, His thermal heat signature would glow like a light source in the infrared spectrum of their sensors. A transport, he thought, remembering the hovercraft he'd ridden to and from his polar experiment. Turning, he searched the nearly dark horizon. A thin crescent sliver of light from one of the planet's small moons cast a dim glow across the featureless plain. The soft light revealed a smoking hulk half melted into an ice crater. A Zoxith laser had already blasted the transporter. "Shit!" Remulkin shouted. But then he saw an opportunity. Hoping the transport's still hot bulk might mask his body's infrared signature, Remulkin scrambled across the ice and slid behind the smoking husk. As he looked back, his breath hitched. The enemy ship plowed through the dust cloud. The Zoxith dreadnought flew straight toward him. In the crescent moon's glow, he could see the evil, grinning alien visage chiseled into the lead asteroid. The huge face appeared to glare down at him as the now motionless ship towered surreally over the destroyed mountain top. Surrendering to his anger and the futility of his concealment efforts, Remulkin stood. Rising to his full height, he defiantly raised both fists toward the Zoxith ship. "Fucking worthless lizards!" he shouted. "You've killed my family and my world!" He raised the two middle fingers of both hands, a derisive Argonian gesture. "Finish the goddamn job!" Remulkin flinched as a brilliant laser shot from the mouth of the alien bust, but it blazed over his head and crossed the horizon behind him. Closing his eyes, Remulkin Thramerus waited for the end. A moment later, the light flooding through his closed eyelids intensified, but somehow he was still alive. Remulkin opened his eyes to an incredible sight. The laser that had shot from the sculpted mouth now fanned up and down. White-hot molten rock sprayed from the vertical line cut by the vibrating beam. Suddenly, a brilliant explosion bisected the ship. As it ruptured, the two halves flew apart, revealing an Argonian battlecruiser closing on his position. Blasting through the fire-filled space vacated by the destroyed enemy ship, the Argonian cruiser sailed toward him. Then its tractor beam yanked Remulkin from the ground. As he accelerated vertically toward the massive warship's gleaming nose, his eons sparkled to life. "Sorry for the abrupt pickup, sir," said a female voice. "But we've just received an order for an immediate withdrawal from this star system." Remulkin passed through a port and into the ship's nose. Across the still open line, he heard the GDF officer speak with someone else. "Another one? Already?" she said. "Oh, gods. Emergency jump now." Inside the airlock at the front of the ship, the normal glow of the small room's walls suddenly intensified. Gripped by a gut-wrenching wave, Remulkin doubled over. An all-consuming fire seemed to burn through him as if it were boiling every cell in his body. With a sickening realization, he understood that this was the same light that had stolen his family. Remulkin latched onto a mental image of them. Through his grimace of pain, he smiled. Finally, Thramerus surrendered to the light. His knees buckled, and he fell to the floor. Chapter 8. "Captain Allison, the General is waiting for you at HQ, the airman said as he snapped a sharp salute. Richard raised hand to brow, returning the greeting. Lowering his arm, the airman pointed to the passenger seat. "Hop in, sir. I'll take you there." Captain Allison nodded and climbed into the roofless and doorless Hummer's right seat. The airman jumped into the driver's seat. He threw the vehicle into gear, but then paused, looking over his shoulder at the turtle, an odd look on his face. A moment later, he turned forward and stomped down on the Hummer's accelerator. Tires squealed their protest as the vehicle roared away from the busy scene. Richard looked over his own shoulder. Squinting into the pre-dawn light flowing from behind Sunrise Mountain, he studied the surreal setting. Military support vehicles and personnel now surrounded the clearly alien ship. Since he'd finished changing back into his flight suit, personnel had swarmed in and out of the space vehicle. After they had got to work, their initial excitement waned. Richard had seen shock hovering just behind their eyes. In the space of half a day, they'd gone from relative innocence, and for most of them, believing we were alone in the universe, to being drawn into an apparent galactic civil war. Then there was the scale of it all. The losses were unimaginable. That thought triggered a deeper understanding of the emotions he'd glimpsed bleeding from everyone's face. How bad was it? How many family members and friends had each person lost? Steering the Hummer onto the base's palm tree-lined main road, the driver stole a sideways glance at Richard. In the young man's eyes, Captain Allison saw the odd, haunted look again. This time, he recognized it as the same look he'd seen in those of the personnel now prepping the turtle. The airman appeared to want something, some reassurance from him, but Richard had no desire to share a moment with the man. He'd been an only child. His parents had passed years ago. His few friends were in the military. Richard's personal exposure was limited to the guilt at how Lieutenant Croft had died. Everybody else was in mourning, all suffering from survivor's guilt at some level. Richard ground his teeth together. He hated those sentiments. Since his parents' passing, he'd associated those feelings with weakness. He shook his head as if doing so could banish the emotions. No, there sure as hell wasn't time for it now. The driver turned on his blinker, then pulled the Hummer up to the curb in front of base headquarters. Stopping across from the main entrance, he turned to Richard, snapping a sharp salute. "Sir, I just want to thank you for what you did up there. Wish I could have given those sons of bitches some payback." "Watch what you wish for," Richard said. "You just might get your chance." He returned the salute. "Thanks for the ride." Before the airman could reply, Richard leaped from the truck. He turned toward HQ's main entrance in time to see General Pearson and his entourage emerge from the building. They made a beeline for Richard. The older man walked as if a great weight rested on his shoulders. Richard supposed it did. Standing at attention, he saluted the general. "Captain Richard Allison reporting as ordered, sir." The general returned the salute, briefly allowing a thin smile to interrupt his stern look. "Captain Allison, indeed. Welcome, son," Pearson said. His eyes darted skyward, and then he gave Richard a meaningful look. "Good job up there." "Thank you, sir." As he lowered his arm, the stoic look returned to the general's face. "Let's move to the conference room." Pivoting on a heel, the big man spun his large frame around, motioning for Richard to walk next to him. Caught flat-footed, Richard stutter-stepped into a jog. Quickly closing the gap, he pulled abreast of the general. As the captain fell into place, the base commander spoke again. "Colonel Newcastle gave me a quick debriefing of what y'all encountered up there. He also briefed me on our present situation. On top of that, I have satellite and observatory data. Hell, half the world watched the battle live on their TV sets. But what I need from you is your feel for what we'll be up against if we encounter more of these. What did Newcastle call them?" "Zoxith, sir," one of the general's aides chimed in before Richard could reply. "Right. Zoxith," the general said. He turned back to Richard, a questioning look on his face. Before he could respond, another aide darted past them and opened the large, frameless glass entry door. Cool air and elevator music spilled from the opening. They walked through the main entrance into a large, circular vestibule. Twin airways bracketed an information desk at the back of the expansive foyer. Left and right of the desk, the stairs followed the curving wall up to the second floor. Richard lost a step as the serene normality of the scene struck him with disorienting surreality. The base commander walked toward the right staircase. As they neared the stairs, the general looked back at him and gave him the go-ahead look again. Richard picked up the pace. They mounted the stairs. The captain cleared his throat and said, "Well, sir, the only one we encountered was already gravely injured, covered head to toe in green blood." "Green blood," the general said. "Holy hell." "Yes, sir," Richard said as they crested the stairs. General Pearson turned and led the procession into a conference room. "But even with all of his injuries, he came at us with incredible ferocity and speed. The thing killed Lieutenant Croft with lightning quickness and extreme violence. Even after 3 point-blank shotgun blasts, we still had to chase him down." As he rounded the end of the room's long table, the general stopped so abruptly Richard narrowly avoided running into the man. "Point blank? Was he wearing body armor?" "No, sir. I think the thing was naked. Before it killed Lieutenant Croft, we had hit its unshielded body 3 times with 12-gauge shotguns. 3 times, the general said. And it kept going. Richard nodded. Yes, sir. Actually, it was hit a couple more times. It didn't stop until Captain Giard managed to drop a huge stone statue onto it. Crushed the bastard. But it still took a shotgun blast through the mouth to kill it. The general remained on his feet. They now stood between 2 American flags. Jesus, the general whispered, digesting Richard's words. Sounds like these monsters won't give up easily. We'll need to plan on more of them showing up. He turned to one of his aides. Get Admiral Johnston on the horn. Orders received, the aide turned and darted out of the conference room. General Pearson turned back to Richard and pointed up. Son, we've got all of those assets just floating around up there. For the time being, with the Joint Chiefs and the rest of the Pentagon out of commission, I'm heading up the effort to put together a space defense force. I'd like to hope the Argonians got out a distress signal and that the cavalry is on the way, but we have to assume they were caught by surprise and didn't make that call. So we're going to take the proverbial bull by the horns, if this bull will let us. He said this last part almost to himself, his eyes taking on a distant look. After a moment, General Pearson shook his head and focused on Richard again. I'm placing naval officers in charge of the large ships. Figure they have the tactical experience for maneuvering large vessels in combat, although they'll have to adjust to operations in 3 dimensions. I plan on manning all those Argonian fighters with all the fighter pilots we can muster in short order. We'll combine them with our existing vampire fighters. Hopefully, Colonel Newcastle and your friend Captain Giard are having some success getting the empty Argonian fleet under control. He paused, giving Richard a hard look. That brings me to the other reason I wanted you here, Captain. With a quick look to the nearest aide, Pearson held out his hand. You have them with you, right, Major? Yes, sir, the officer said. The Major gave Richard an odd smile and dropped something small into the general's open hand. Turning back to Richard, the base commander said, Stand at attention, son. This is the first time I've done this, so let's try to make it look official. Confused, Richard complied with the general's order, snapping to attention. Captain Allison saw one of the officers begin to video the general. The base commander studied Richard's flight suit. Well, I guess we'll pin these on your collar for now. You can have them sewn onto your shoulder later. After a brief pause, the general continued. Hold out your left hand, palm up. Richard complied, and the general placed 2 small metallic items on his palm. Still at attention and staring straight ahead, Captain Allison couldn't see them. Pearson retrieved one of the items and grabbed one of Richard's flight suit collars. Son, I'm giving you and Captain Giard battlefield promotions to Lieutenant Colonel. I discussed this with Zach Newcastle. I'm putting Colonel Newcastle in charge of all space fighters. We decided that your heroic actions against these aliens, coupled with your familiarity with Argonian systems, makes you 2 our best candidates to head up the integration of the Argonian space fighters. After pinning the silver oak leaves to Richard's flight suit collar, General Pearson stood back and saluted Richard. Congratulations, Lieutenant Colonel Allison. Richard finally snapped out of his dumbfounded trance and returned the general's salute. Thank you, sir. Lowering their arms, the men shook hands. Richard's head spun. He couldn't believe it. A 2-rank promotion. As he considered the responsibility the general had just dropped on his shoulders, the lieutenant colonel rank insignia suddenly seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. Thank you, sir, Richard finally said, his voice cracking. I won't let you down. You had better not, Colonel. Chapter 9. Standing in the dark, the 5th columnist stroked the back of his head. 5th columnist, he whispered, trying the title on for size. He liked it. Considering the term came from Earth, likely a dead planet, although they still awaited news on that matter. He thought the title appropriate. He wondered if his contacts would know its meaning, understand the irony. He doubted it. The 5th columnist, the enemy within, stroked the back of his head again. Still, it brought no relief. He needed to take action. Worlds, hell, entire species were at stake. But the last time he took action, so much was lost. A family, a world, a war. He wouldn't contact them. He had to. He wouldn't. He will. Chapter 10. Neural napping complete. Please initiate Eon function check. Opening his eyes, Jake blinked against the bright light and looked around. Disoriented, he thought he was back on the turtle. Sitting up, he rubbed his eyes, then froze. Slowly, Jake lowered his hands and looked down. Where his head had been, a small drop of blood shrank, then disappeared. Looking at the now spotless white surface, he probed the back of his head. Finding a tender area, Jake withdrew his hand to discover a single spot of blood smeared across the tip of his middle finger. "What the?" Jake whispered. His eyes widened as images flashed through his mind. Lights flowing through seemingly ancient bronzed halls, a strange, empty white room, a table growing from a floor. Something had swept him off his feet. Then a black void had swallowed him. Shit. He leaped from the table. What the hell? Landing in a crouched fighting stance, he remembered a voice had woken him, but he couldn't recall what it had said. As if reading his thoughts, the feminine voice returned. Neural napping complete. Please initiate Eon function check. Jake jumped, then shook his head. It was just the ship's automated voice, but this time its words sounded strangely flat, as if the walls were absorbing the sound waves, robbing the voice of its normal echo. Neural mapping complete. Please initiate Eon function check. Again, he wondered what the hell an Eon was. Eon is an acronym for Electro-Organic Networking Modem, the same voice replied. Well, that answers one question, Jake said, marveling at how seamlessly his implanted Argonian language algorithms converted the alien language and even its acronyms. It would be nice if the damn translation included the knowledge of what the hell an Eon is, though, he thought. The Eon facilitates integration with the ship's network and computer systems. Jake looked around the room. That's spooky. Almost like the computer read my mind. Actually, Captain Giard, the Eon's interface reads your thoughts, analyzes their content, and then transmits pertinent issues to me for resolution. Startled at hearing the computer refer to him by name and confirming his concern that the ship was reading his mind, Jake spun and yelled at the walls. What did you do to me? Where is this Eon? The Eon is a nanoscale brain implant. Implant! Jake screamed. Remembering the spot of blood, he ran a hand over his head again. Aside from the slightly sensitive area behind and below his left ear, he found nothing. The MedSys uses a transcranial injection to insert the nanites into your cerebrum, the feminine computer voice announced. Once in position, they self-assemble into a network, harmlessly establishing neural communication pathways and protocols. After becoming operational, the Eon safely communicates with the ship's network through non-ionizing subspace frequencies. Jake continued to rub the sore spot, realizing that it must be the injection site. The ship's network? How do I interface with it? And what can it do for me? And why does your voice sound so flat? Now that your Eon is functional, I am no longer employing external speakers. There is no oral output. I am communicating with you directly through your Eon. In his head or not, the computer's feminine voice took on a confused tone. These are highly unusual questions for a uniformed Argonian. You should already be quite familiar with the Eon and all of its functions. Jake looked down at his spacesuit. I'm not Argonian, although genetically I guess I am. A tearing paper sound filled the room. The opening in the floor closed again. It had shut after he initially entered the room. It must have opened while he was on the table. The thought reminded him about the 1-hour check-in with Colonel Newcastle. Consulting his watch, he saw 55 minutes had elapsed. The computer's Argonian voice interrupted his thoughts, its tone now authoritarian. Non-Argonian, You are an unauthorized user. I have sealed off the room and notified security." "Good luck with that," Jake said. "I did not understand that language. Please restate in Argonian." "Just read my thoughts," Jake responded in Argonian. "The network protocols limit outputs to a synchronization carrier, data queries, and computer commands. I am unable to access your thoughts unless the Eon determines you desire access to the aforementioned protocols." "So why did you lead me here?" "When I detected no carrier from your life sign, I analyzed your gene code. Finding you are Argonian, I sent you the oral alerts that led you here. If you're not Argonian as you claim, I'm unsure how you got past security, but I'm sure they will rectify it." "I wouldn't count on that," Jake said in Argonian. After a brief hesitation, the automated voice said, "Strangely, I am not receiving a reply." "Haven't you noticed things are very quiet on your network?" "Yes. However, I assumed it was an extension of the Zoxith disruptor field." "This thing doesn't even know it's alone," Jake thought. "Do you have the ability to do a life sign search?" "Of course I do," the computer responded with an indignant tone. "So you have emotions," Jake thought. "I wonder if you're sentient." "Your query has been received. I am not sentient, as you would define it. I am programmed with logic and self-protection protocols. However, the Argonians built in strict limitations to prevent computer self-awareness." Her words gave Jake an idea. "Listen, you and your entire fleet are in grave danger. Do a life sign scan. The ship is empty. Your entire Argonian crew has been wiped out by the Zoxith." The computer's voice came back less sure. "Stand by. Scanning. Scanning." "Scan the entire fleet," Jake said. "Scan complete. As you stated, aside from your life sign, I can find no others within the entire fleet." "We need to take immediate action. Some of your ships are getting dangerously close to re-entering the atmosphere." "Argonians are required to be involved in all fleet-wide commands. I have very limited authority over the fleet's ships." "Your ships are about to start a long tumble into the ocean below. We're not at orbital speed, but who knows what's going to happen to your drifting ships when they fall into our atmosphere. Hell, they might not make it to the ocean. The jet stream could send them crashing into mountains." "Argonian protocols only give me the authority to prevent their destruction." "I believe I have a solution." "I'm all ears," it said with a sarcastic tone. Jake paused at the apparent joke. Was this thing programmed with humor, too? "Yes, I was." "What?" "Shit, never mind. Listen, you already know that genetically I am Argonian. What you don't know is that I'm part of a lost Argonian colony that inhabits this planet," Jake said, pointing through the floor. "The GDF came here to defend us from the Zoxith. So in all the ways that matter, I am Argonian. You need to release me from here and give me access to bridge functions. Then I can give my people access to the fleet." "I cannot hand over control without Galactic Defense Force authorization," the ship's computer said, more unease creeping into its electronic voice. "You said you have self-protection protocols built in, right?" "Yes, although I don't see how that is pertinent to the discussion. Instituting said self-protection protocols, I placed the fleet's ships in a safer position after you told me of their peril. They are safely away from the planet's atmosphere." "That's a good start," Jake said with a sigh of relief. "But what will happen to your ships when the rest of the Zoxith show up? My people are putting together a large task force to ensure the protection of the fleet. However, without your assistance, we may all be doomed. The next wave of Zoxith ships will destroy this fleet and do the same to this planet's Argonians as they did to this fleet's." The computer fell silent. Jake worried he'd pushed it too far, that he'd been cut off, and was now a prisoner in this egg-shaped inverted oubliette. "Hey, do you—" The familiar white noise of an opening door cut off his question. Jake turned and found the floor hatch had reappeared. "Your logic is sound," the computer announced through the Eon connection. "That's great," Jake said, but his excitement faltered as a mental tingling and disorientation swept over him, the same sensations he'd experienced when the late General Tannehill implanted the Argonian language algorithms into his brain. For a horrified moment, Jake grabbed his head with both hands. Could the edification encoder be reversed? Was the computer de-edifying him? Had she placated him just long enough to wipe his memories? Then the sensation faded. "What did you do to me?" Jake said, as he blinked his eyes back into focus. He found he could still remember Rita Johnson, his first kiss, so hopefully the rest was still there too. "I upgraded your Eon access and integrated it with the ship's systems. You'll find ship maps and function keys." Jake nodded. "That's great, but from now on I'd appreciate a little heads up. Please let me know before you put anything else in my brain." "I'll try to keep that in mind," the computer said sardonically. "Now I'll give you command override authority," she said in a patronizing tone as if talking to a 6-year-old. "However, to employ it, you will need to proceed to the bridge." Jake was about to call the computer a smartass, but the disorienting mental prickle returned, and just as quickly ceased. Performing a quick inventory, he discovered a complete mental map of all ship functions and commands. Jake's irritation with the computer's patronizing tone evaporated. "This is awesome. Thank you." Using his now full understanding of the Eon and its abilities, he accessed the ship's communication center. Jake made firmware modifications, enabling one of the Argonian radios to work on the correct range of frequencies. "Vampire 6, this is the..." Jake paused, pulling up the ship's name. "The Galactic Guardian, over." "Captain's yard," came a relieved voice. "Where in the hell have you been? You're late for our 1-hour check-in." "Sorry, sir." "Hell, son," the colonel interrupted. "You done great. I don't know how you did it, but all of the Argonian ships have regrouped around the carrier." I made contact with the ships." Jake paused. Looking at the ceiling, he tried to think of the right words. "Computer intelligence. Convinced it to give me access to its command functions." Not waiting for the colonel's questions, he stepped toward the opening in the floor and continued speaking. "But I can only execute the important ones from the bridge. Once I'm there, I'll bring the fighters into the hangar. Then I'll let your squadron in as well." "Great job, son," the colonel said. "I can't wait to hear how you're doing all that, but for now, I'll stand by for your signal." "Roger, sir." Galactic Guardian out. Air Force Captain Sandra Fitzpatrick dropped the blood-covered flight suit into a red plastic biohazard bag. After tossing in the rest of her soiled garments and boots, she kicked the whole mess into the tiled corner of the command center's shower room. The bag came to rest next to a full-length mirror. In it, Sandy studied her nude visage. She gently probed the sealed wounds on her right waistline where the corpsman had dug out the 2 pellets. He told her she'd been lucky that it had been a ricochet and that it had only been 2. Wincing, she didn't feel lucky, but she knew it could have been much worse. Sandy slid her hand to her flat stomach. The baby bump remained a future development. The corpsman had confirmed she was still pregnant in spite of the best efforts of hostile aliens and drugged-out looters. A fog spread across the top of her reflected image, tugging Sandy from her thoughts. She stepped into the already running shower. Its jet of hot water coursed through her gore-stained hair. Gray bits of brain matter and ochre blood sluiced off her and streamed across white floor tiles. As the meth head's effluence washed from Sandy's body, the water faded to pink. Finally, the last of what the fuck buck ran down the drain, and it ran clear. Sometime later, Sandy stepped from the room in the new uniform General Pearson's aide had supplied. The flight suit fit perfectly, but the boots needed breaking in. She planned to give them plenty of exercise. Sandy had no plans to slow down, not with all that had happened. The corpsman had tried to convince her to report her pregnancy, had even threatened to do it himself. However, Sandy had issued her own threats, promising the young corporal serious bodily harm if he breathed a word to anyone. After a glance at the splattered blood and brains of the last person who had crossed her, he'd clammed up. Walking toward the base's command control center, or C3, Sandy tried to minimize the limp she'd earned when she'd ejected from her doomed F-22. The knee brace the corpsman supplied worked better than the aluminum strut she'd fashioned into a splint, and its slim lines were barely noticeable under the flight suit's baggy legs. Stepping into the C3, Sandy spotted General Pearson. The female major at his side, his aide, nodded at her. Sandy approached and then stood at attention. When the general noticed her, Sandy saluted. "Captain Sandra Fitzpatrick reporting for duty, sir." "Attention!" shouted an officer as Richard entered the briefing theater. The large chamber was full of pilots. All of them stood and snapped to attention. Stepping up to the podium, Richard scanned the room. The assembled personnel stood on arcing ledges, each higher than the row in front of it, like a theater with stadium seating. Most of the faces staring back at him were no older than he was. Suddenly self-conscious, Richard raised a hand. "Please, take your seats. Take your seats." Slowly, the officer sat. A nervous silence fell across the room. The American contingent filled the left half of the theater. Russian aviators occupied the right third. Pilots from Europe, Australia, Africa, and the Middle East filled the rest. All of them had segregated themselves by geography. Richard knew he'd have to do something about that. He stifled a smile when he saw the Israeli and Saudi contingents eyeing each other warily. A wide spectrum of emotions radiated from the assembled pilots. Apprehension, excitement, dread, and eagerness stared from 1,000 faces. Realizing these men and women needed more than just deployment orders, he changed his plan. "Ladies and gentlemen, I came in here with the intention of briefing you on our short-term plan for staffing the abandoned fleet. However, by the looks on your faces, I think it would be worthwhile for us to take a moment to discuss our situation first. I'm sure you've all heard varying versions of what we're up against, and the events that transpired during the battle for Earth, as the news networks are calling it." The change in the room was palpable. The men and women began to focus on Richard's story and less on their own concerns. He described the events from his personal perspective, providing nuances and angles not available in a news report. He effectively personalized the situation, giving the officers ownership of the struggle. Richard was planting the seeds that he hoped would lead to the formation of a cohesive unit. Finishing the narrative, he scanned the room. Richard still saw hints of apprehension and dread, but the vast majority of the faces staring back at him now looked resolute, determined, ready to receive their orders. That, or they were just tired of his voice. Either way, it was time to hand out shuttle assignments. There were way too many people for the Turtle to carry on 1 or even 10 trips. The stack of papers in front of Richard had all of the pilots' names. The admin officer that had handed him the 2-inch-thick pile of documents said that he had sorted the personnel by country. Looking across the geographically segregated theater, Richard smiled. On the podium, he cut the ream of papers like a deck of cards and began to shuffle the sheets. Stepping over another vacated uniform, Jake entered the bridge and was immediately overwhelmed by its breathtaking scale and grandeur. The Eon had provided him with mental images and detailed specs on the operations command section. However, seeing it with his own eyes was far more impressive. The bridge's interior was roughly the size of a high school gymnasium, both horizontally and vertically. A huge floor-to-ceiling view wall filled the long, forward-facing side like a curved 200-foot-wide, super ultra-high-definition television screen. It looked similar to the one inside the Turtle, but significantly larger. The other 3 walls had the same ancient, antiqued bronze look he'd seen in the ship's expansive halls and passageways. Something akin to an earthly bird of prey, like an eagle or a hawk, adorned the upper corners. Each appeared to be caught in a perpetual dive toward the center of the bridge, their talons outstretched, beaks thrust into the onrushing air, their wings pinned back. With the Eon's assistance, he accessed the bridge's hologram controls. As Jake activated it, he almost fell forward. Earth's surface suddenly filled the lower rear portion of the bridge, immersing Jake knee-deep in a sloped rendering of the Atlantic Ocean. The size and clarity of the hologram, coupled with the planet's odd angle, momentarily disoriented him. Regaining his balance, Jake looked up from the ocean to see a rendering of the GDF fleet hovering overhead. He also saw small green icons that the computer identified as the Earth-based Vampire Squadron. It looked like the rest of Newcastle's fighters had rejoined him in space. Like a malevolent overseer, a red rendering of the Zoxith ship Remnant hovered some distance to the left of the fleet. Jake knew the bridge contained another level, an invisible elevated command deck. He walked up to one of its dedicated lift points. As he stepped into the yellow ring of light, he began to rise. A moment later, the lift gently deposited him onto the clear force field-generated floor. As soon as he landed on the translucent surface, Jake gained access to an enhanced range of controls. This elevated deck served as the main control point for all fleet-level commands. Staring into the hologram, he magnified the rendering. Using thoughts instead of gestures to adjust the display, he zoomed in on the fleet. "Wow," he whispered. A crooked grin curled one corner of his mouth. Inventorying the empty Argonian fighter fleet, he discovered their institutional framework. The GDF had organized their units in a hierarchical structure that any human military officer would recognize. Jake left the ship unit assignments unchanged and directed them to their standard parking pads. No need to reinvent the wheel. Standing on the elevated deck, Jake watched hundreds of green holographic fighters stream into the ethereal Gothic Guardian that now floated just over his head. As the last fighter disappeared into the carrier's aft section, Jake turned to Vampire Fighter Squadron. With a mental command, he assigned them to a specific hangar location. One thought later, they joined the fleet's organizational structure. "This is awesome," Jake thought. He looked at Newcastle's 17 fighters, 8 to port and 7 to starboard. Each vessel hovered oriented on the twin hangar bay openings like prison guards monitoring returning inmates. Stepping closer, Jake kicked something. When he looked down, his excitement died. He frowned at the empty Argonian uniform crumpled at his feet. His Eon identified its rank insignia as Fleet Admiral. Admiral Fadyak, Jake realized, shaking his head at the insanity of the day's events. Dragging his gaze from the vacated uniform, he turned his attention back to the holographic Vampire Fighter Squadron. The process of getting them to their assigned hangar space took a few more steps. He activated the modified radio. "Vampire 6, this is Galactic Guardian Bridge, over." "Galactic Guardian Bridge, this is Vampire 6. Hot damn, son. You're doing a fine job. The Argonian fleet just flew into the hangars." "Thank you, sir," Jake said. "I've given access to your squadron. The Galactic Guardian's tractor beam has been set to guide your ships to their assigned pads. Figured I'd better alert you so you're not surprised when your ships start moving." "Roger, Guardian." Colonel Newcastle's gruff voice crackled over the radio. "I've just received word the Turtle will be lifting shortly with its first contingent. I want you to remain on the bridge for now. I'll link up with the senior commanders and we'll meet you on the bridge for a debriefing." After a quick consultation with the Eon, Jake responded. "Copy, Vampire 6. I've set up an illuminated pathway, a set of moving lights that will lead you to the bridge from the exit at the hangar's forward wall. We'll see you there. Vampire 6 out." Chapter 11. Just as Romulcan was sure his body would surrender to the energy burning through it, the light evaporated, chased away by the familiar sensation of parallel space entry. A moment later, his guts wrenched again. Not the burning, family-stealing fire this time, only the regular yank from superluminal speed. After a short jump, the ship had apparently dropped back into regular space. Thramarys struggled to his feet. Hunched over, he tried to shake off the sensations that threatened to overwhelm him. Breathing heavily, with hands on his knees to support his upper body, he looked around the airlock. The ship seemed normal. Its interior walls now glowed with their usual intensity. The parallel space jump had only lasted seconds, but considering the vessel's superluminal speed, he knew an appreciable chunk of a light year now sat between them and the enemy. He knew that the GDF took steps to make their emergency egress parallel space jumps untraceable, so they were safe from the Zoxith's weapon, for now. Finally able to stand upright, he stumbled to the airlock's inner door. Tucked into the bottom of the battlecruiser's nose, the small room's location placed him a good distance from the bridge. Having spent a sizable portion of his short military career assigned to a deployed carrier, Romulcan knew his way around the fleet's complement of ships. While he'd never served on a battlecruiser, he knew the ship's logistician would be waiting on the other side of this airlock door. The officer's duties would include tractor beam operations. As he drew close, the door opened. Remulkin froze. Something was very wrong. Instead of the anticipated post-jump bustle, deafening silence oozed through the open door. Only a slow, staccato drip pierced the ominous quietude. "What the fuck?" Remulkin whispered. Lying across the floor, as if cleaved at an odd angle, a man's upper torso blocked the exit. His extended right arm looked like it was reaching for the door. Below the elbow, his left arm was gone. With surreal clarity, Remulkin watched as a swelling drop of blood desperately clung to the stump's lowest point. With a quivering release, it lost its battle with gravity and fell into the waiting puddle of blood. The loud report of its splashdown caused Remulkin to spasm as if he'd been shocked. Beyond the halved body of the man, likely the logistics officer, long, bright red streaks of arterial blood adorned every surface, even the ceiling. With growing horror, Remulkin stepped over the officer's extended arm. The dead man's empty pants, sitting in the spreading pool of blood and half covered with unrestrained entrails, lay flat where his lower torso should have been. Closer now, he realized the officer's upper torso was tapered. The shape under his tunic showed the man was cut along an angle extending from his central back, just below the shoulder blades, down and forward to just above his pelvis. Visible in a gap between his shirt and pants, only entrails and blood extended below the bisecting line. Remulkin realized that the man had been bending at the waist when it happened. Empty socks extended from empty shoes into empty pant legs. Positioned between the tractor beam control panel and the airlock door, the only portion of the officer's body still present was that part closest to the airlock's inner door, the portion closest to the nose and apparently farthest from the enemy weapon. In the nose of the ship, with his back to the airlock, Remulkin faced aft and considered how much of the battlecruiser lay behind that line. He already knew the answer. All of it. Oh, shit. Just as fast as it leaped into the emergency parallel space jump, the helm warden dropped back into real space. As it did, the compressed fisheye of stars ahead of the ship's nose blossomed to surround it. Still doubled over, Admiral Takama gripped his command console. The internal voice of his resynchronized network ID still screamed for his attention. "Not now," he sent to his other half. With a massive application of will, he stood upright, bracing himself against the console. Through withering pain and clenched teeth, he ordered, "Report!" The tactical officer struggled to her feet. "Checking, sir." As the woman consulted the data streaming through her console, Takama surveyed the scene beyond the view wall. Signaling the fleet's arrival, hundreds of flashes illuminated the bridge. Each pulse of the ethereal light signaled the arrival of another ship as it dropped back into regular space. "Sir, the fleet has rejoined." "How much of it?" Takama asked in a cracked voice. "All but the Monarch's stand and 1st Fighter Squadron Admiral." In a choked voice, she added, "They still haven't checked in. I can't see their subspace transponders either. The enemy must have reactivated the disruptor." "It doesn't matter. We've lost them," Takama said flatly. Glaring through the view wall, he studied the white point of light of Chuvarti's star and pointed at the woman. "With that subspace jammer back in place, we can't transmit the self-destruct command from here. Send a fighter back in. Tell them to fly into the Chuvarti system until they get close enough to transmit the self-destruct code via the backup radio channel. They are to keep their distance from all enemy ships, and if the disruptor field goes down, they need to perform an immediate emergency egress." "But, sir, you can't know they're all gone," she said. "There might be survivors on those—" "No," Takama said, turning from the display and cutting her off. "They're gone. Now transmit the order, Major." After the briefest hesitation, the officer complied. Takama shook his head. He should have recognized the dropping of the disruptor field for what it was, should have ordered the emergency fallback that instant. The woman looked up from her console. "What was that light, sir?" "A goddamned banned weapon!" Takama shouted. The woman's head snapped back as if he'd slapped her. "Sorry, Major," he said. She blinked her confusion. Myriad questions blossomed across her face. The Admiral shook his head. "No time," he said softly. "I'll brief everyone later." "Yes, sir," she said after a brief pause. Takama activated a small hologram recording of the moments before the fleet had jumped out of the Chuvardi system. In the paused video, the image of the doomed monarch's stand and the dreadnought that had destroyed it coalesced before him. Melded perpendicularly across their midsections, the two ships expanded until the battlecruiser was about the size of a man. Takama stepped closer. His face glowed red and green. The majestic lines of the Argonian ship contrasted sharply against the rocky protuberances of the dreadnought's cobbled-together asteroids. Activating the three-dimensional video, Takama watched as the weapon's energy wave erupted from the melded ships, instantly enveloping both. Verbalizing his Eon commands, he said, "Slow playback 1,000 times. Magnify Zoxith bridge section to max resolution. Replay from 1 millisecond before weapon detonation." His electro-organic system issued the commands. Takama stepped back. The holographic representation of the enemy ship's bridge grew to fill the open space between the command deck and the high ceiling. Its cold red light washed across the bridge. The Admiral rotated the enemy ship. The carved asteroid's Zoxith face glared down at him, its fangs forever frozen in the act of crunching an Argonian skull. "Play," Takama ordered through his Eon interface. The alien's partially opened mouth started glowing. Even at the incredibly slow replay speed, the energy wave raced outward, quickly expanding out of view. "Reverse," Takama ordered. The energy wave shrunk back and disappeared into the Zoxith ship's bridge. Extrapolating the motion, Ashtara placed the weapon's location at the sculpted asteroid's geometric center. The tactical officer interrupted his thoughts. "Sir, the Liberator hasn't checked in." Takama looked at her. "You said all other ships had checked in." She nodded. "Their transponder is responding to pings, sir, but I can't raise anyone on her bridge. They're not responding to radio or subspace hails." He deactivated the display. Turning from the dissolving hologram, Takama said, "That's the battlecruiser I sent to pick up the scientist. Keep trying them." "Yes, sir." Turning from the officer, Takama accessed the Liberator's data. Nothing. The battlecruiser had been well into enemy-held space. He tried to open a direct Eon connection with its captain. Commander Basil didn't respond. Her icon remained grayed out. The Liberator was as silent as a cemetery. Takama instantly regretted the analogy. At least cemeteries had occupants. Leaving the horrific scene behind him, Remolkin walked out of the ship's tractor beam control room. As he traveled aft from the vessel's nose, the circumstances in each consecutive room confirmed his worst fears. In every compartment, empty uniforms lay strewn about in random patterns. He saw no other partially vaporized bodies. These crew members had completely vanished. The doubled-over and curled-up positions of all the person-shaped articles painted a picture of pre-death agony. Breathing heavily, he hurried through the sections. Passing deeper into the ship, he found more of the same. Shit. Now running, Remolkin quickly passed from room to room, working toward the ship's central lift. His heart raced as his panic mounted. He slid to a stop in the lower deck's central chamber. Wide-eyed, he stared at the hundreds of empty uniforms. Mounting panic threatened to overwhelm him. It felt like his heart would soon burst from his chest. Bent over, Remolkin struggled to breathe, but every breath just brought him closer to vomiting. His unnerved sprint hadn't helped. "Oh, God," Thramoris whispered. He closed his eyes, but the vision of blinding light swallowing his family chased him out of that dark refuge. Facing that agony now would finish Remolkin just as assuredly as would a plasma bolt to his heart. The scientist stared at the floor. "Have to move," he said between gasps. A few labored breaths later, the giant fist squeezing his pounding heart seemed to relax its grip. Presently, the ringing in his ears subsided. Finally, Remolkin stood upright. When he didn't pass out, he walked on trembling legs toward the lift. It opened, revealing 2 bodies. The crew members floated slack, unmoving in the lift's gravity-free zone. Their backs were turned to him. Hidden behind their slumped-over uniforms, it looked like their heads were hanging down. Extending his right arm, the scientist reached into the tube's weightless environment. "Hey," Remolkin said as he reached for the nearest crew member's shoulder. "Are you?" His hand closed on empty fabric. Stifling a scream, he yanked back his arm. The empty uniforms tumbled out of shape and began to float around in the zero-G environment of the lift's interior. Without gravity and disturbing drafts of air, they had maintained their shapes and positions, despite the absence of their former occupants. Panic tried to take him again. Bending over, he inhaled deeply. When he could no longer hold it, Remolkin released the pent-up breath in a long, cursing exhalation. Fuck! 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 Holding the grab bar adjacent to the lift opening, the scientist inserted his arm into the gravity-free cylindrical space. He quickly swept it through the drifting clothes as if their owners might return at any moment. As they passed into the central chamber's normal gravity field, the empty articles fell into a pile just outside of the lift. Avoiding the heaped uniforms, Remolkin leaped into the tube too fast. He ricocheted off the lift's interior walls twice before arresting his weightless inertia. The man held an interior handhold and extended a trembling hand toward the lift's controls. His third attempt activated it. The scientist began to rise toward the distant bridge level. His body accelerated up the narrow tube. Speed-blurred deck markings flashed past him. As he neared the top of the lift tunnel, their passage slowed. Then he stopped just below the tube's upper limit. The markings confirmed that this was the command deck. But nothing happened. The door didn't open. Damn it. Holding onto a grab bar, he jabbed at the manual door controls. Still nothing. With mounting anger, he jabbed at them again. Then he remembered something from his military days. God damn it. Shaking his head, Remolkin toggled the lift's controls. Returning to the previous room, he searched through the strewn uniforms. Finally finding what he needed, he returned to the lift. As he raised toward the bridge level, he studied the item. From his years in the Galactic Defense Forces, he knew that the small metallic badge contained a transponder. While the Eon was the primary way to access most compartments, appropriately cleared individuals used these devices to access sensitive areas. They worked even if Eon connectivity failed. This time, the hatch opened as soon as he returned to the lift's bridge level. Waves of light and sound burst through the opening. Using the grab bars, he launched himself onto the bridge's command deck. He landed inelegantly and dropped to his hands and knees. During his days in the military, he'd done the maneuver hundreds of times without failing. Of course, back then, he hadn't had the expansive midsection. Clambering to his feet, he stepped over another vacated uniform. Standing, he scanned the battlecruiser's bridge. Hundreds of holographic ships filled its voluminous overhead space. Remolkin was thankful to see that all of them were green, although red combat lighting still painted the bridge in its night vision-preserving lambency. When the battle had ended, no one had been left to deactivate them. Through the cacophony of bells and klaxons, he heard voices coming from a nearby control panel. "Liberator, this is Helm Warden. Please respond." He stepped to the console. Remolkin remembered enough about its operation to recognize that the transmission was coming in on a private channel. So this ship must be the Liberator, and the Helm Warden was trying to raise it. The communicator wouldn't respond to his Eon. Remolkin's trembling hand pressed the manual override. "Helm Warden, this is the Liberator." "Liberator," the woman said with evident relief. "What is your status?" Remolkin looked around the bridge. His eyes fell on the vacated uniform of the ship's apparently female captain draped across the command console. He shook his head. Angry, and with a horrible sense of déjà vu, he said, "Everybody is dead." "Everybody?" the officer said in a confused tone. "Yes," he said, starting to grind his teeth. Everybody aft of the forward airlock was vaporized. The scientist felt something in him snap. He wanted to throttle the idiot. "They're all fucking gone," he screamed. "I'm the only goddamned survivor!" After a long pause, the stupid woman's tentative voice returned. "Oh my gods. Is this Remulcan Thrameris?" "Got it in one," he shouted. Slamming a fist into the communicator, Remulcan terminated the connection. Turning from the console, he stared up into the field of holographic ships. They should have left him on Chuvardi. Why hadn't they just let him die? Tears tried to burn their way into his eyes, but he brusquely wiped them away. Remulcan glared at the wavering green rendering of the Helm Warden, Takama's flagship. "Thanks for nothing, asshole." Chapter 12. Heat waves shimmered like a silver lake levitating above the baking tarmac. On the eastern horizon, Sunrise Mountain buttressed an azure ocean of air. The image reminded Richard of his drive with Victor and Jake across the Area 51 tarmac. Good God, that was just a day ago, he thought. After everything that had happened, it felt like a lifetime had passed. Lowering his face to study the gathering personnel, Richard realized his perception was correct. A lifetime had indeed passed. When a large chunk of the world's population had vanished, it had taken that previous life with it. The odd mix of service members finished forming up. They regarded Richard silently. He smiled and nodded to the few he knew. Each person had dropped off their equipment and bags. A chain of Air Force airmen had whisked the stuff into the Turtle's airlock. Once full, the lock would seal itself and lift the items to the vessel's main floor. On that deck, another chain of airmen would transfer it to the Turtle's top floor. Outside, the assembled formation consisted of personnel of all types. Fighter pilots represented more than half of the group currently staring at Richard. Various combat and support types filled the rest of the first flight slots. Navy SEALs and Army Special Ops constituted the majority of the expedition's frontline forces. Everything else from cooks to doctors rounded out the tally of collected personnel. Richard's deck-shuffling stunt had ensured the multinational face of the first wave of pilots. However, for logistical simplicity, American military personnel filled the rest of the positions. Well, at least we aren't taking any lawyers, he thought. Finishing his scan of the group, Richard decided they were ready. Receiving his nod, the senior sergeant snapped to attention and shouted, "Task Force, attention!" The well-disciplined, highly motivated group followed his lead, snapping to attention in unison. The sergeant did an about-face and saluted sharply. "Colonel, Wave 1 of Task Force Swift Vengeance present and ready for duty." Standing at attention as well, Richard returned the salute. "Thank you, Chief." The man lowered his arm and moved to his station behind and right of the colonel. "At ease," Richard shouted, permitting the group an opportunity to relax while he gave them one last pre-flight briefing. "In a moment, the Master Sergeant is going to have you file into the Turtle. The airmen inside will show you to your positions for the transfer to space. Our plan is to have you stand in concentric arcing rows. They will follow the circular shape of the ship's interior. Hopefully, the computer will recognize our needs and provide seating of some sort, although we've never tried anything like this. Before we proceed, I just want to take this last moment to tell all of you how proud I am to have this opportunity to work with you. The command contingent will be here shortly, and once we arrive at the main ship, you'll be broken down into your individual units, regardless of which command you fall under. Best of luck, and Godspeed. That is all." "Task Force, attention!" the Chief Master Sergeant screamed over Richard's shoulder. Then he moved to stand in front of Richard again and saluted. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Allison returned it. "Carry on, Chief." The Chief Master Sergeant issued his orders, and the task force began to board the ship. Some of the personnel were waving at their loved ones. Richard had decided to allow them access to the departure. Considering the entire world had seen the alien ships attacking the planet, the need for secrecy now seemed like an exercise in futility. Movement near the tarmac's access gate caught Richard's attention. Turning to investigate, he saw General Pearson's Humvee driving toward the turtle. 3 more Hummers followed. The lead vehicle bore 2 flags, one on each side of the hood. The left one had the General's 3-star rank insignia, while the right bore an Admiral's rank insignia. Richard guessed it would be the Admiral that General Pearson had referred to during their meeting. As the last of the task force disappeared into the turtle, the lead Humvee slid to a stop in front of Richard. The driver jumped out to open the door, but the base commander opened it himself and stepped onto the tarmac. Outside the turtle, scattered personnel continued their work. Someone started to call them to attention. However, the general waved this away. "Carry on." Richard saluted the base commander. "Good afternoon, General. Wave 1 of the task force is in place, sir. The personnel are assembled in the turtle." As the general returned the salute, Richard got his first glimpse of the Admiral. He definitely looked the part. Tan, lean face, wrinkled as if weathered by years at sea. Richard supposed it may have been. Hair as white as his uniform, cut so close it was almost invisible in the area not covered by his headgear. General Pearson patted Richard on the shoulder. "Good job, Colonel Allison." Gesturing to his right, he continued. "This is Admiral Johnston. He is now Supreme Commander, Space Operations. I will continue to work here to coordinate and oversee all activities between space-based and Earth-based operations." The general turned toward Admiral Johnston. "Bill, this is the officer I told you about." Pouring from the Hummers that had been following the general's vehicle, a group of fellow Air Force lieutenant colonels and Navy commanders streamed behind the men and into the turtle. Richard saluted again. "Pleased to meet you, sir." Admiral Johnston returned it and then offered his hand. Richard took it. "Colonel Allison, you done our nation, no, our planet, a great service. It's a pleasure to meet you. You and your team demonstrated the initiative and drive that will be required of us all in the days, weeks, and, God willing, months to come. I'm proud to have you and Giard on my team." "The honor is mine, sir," Richard said. They watched as the last of their command staff disappeared into the turtle's airlock. "Hopefully none of this will be necessary," Richard added. "From your lips to God's ears, son," the Admiral said with a nod. They began to walk toward the turtle. The Chief Master Sergeant gave Richard a quick thumbs up. Turning to Admiral Johnson, Richard said, "Sir, the airmen loaded your baggage and equipment when it was sent over. It looks like everything is ready for us in the turtle, so unless there is other business needing your attention, I believe we are ready to depart." "Well, I'm ready, Colonel," the Admiral said, and then nodded to General Pearson. "John, I'll be in touch. We'll get things up and running in short order. Then God help those sons of bitches if they decide to show their scaly mugs again. Go get 'em, Bill. I know you'll give them what for." Salutes were exchanged, and the officers parted ways. Reaching the opening, Richard gestured for the Admiral to enter the airlock, then followed him in. When the opposite door opened, he heard the chief call the task force to attention. The Admiral quickly told them to carry on. The chief led the Admiral to a seat just behind the control panel. Stepping to the console, Richard scanned the seated personnel. The Chief Master Sergeant stepped next to him and spoke into his ear. "It was the damnedest thing, sir. As soon as the ship saw how we were filling in, these raised rows of seats just grew right out of the floor. It even adjusted the height of each row so they all have an unobstructed view of the main display." "Couldn't have asked for anything more," Richard said. Then he turned and addressed the seated service members. "We'll be departing momentarily. This will be a relatively short flight. As I described in the briefing, the Argonian drive has acceleration that can be visually impressive. However, you won't feel a thing. It can be quite disorienting, though." They all nodded. Richard smiled inwardly. There really were no words to prepare them for what they were about to experience. He turned to the control console and toggled the radio panel. "Nellis Tower, this is Turtle 1, ready for departure." "Turtle 1, this is Nellis Tower. You are cleared to depart as filed." "Good luck up there. We're counting on you." "Roger, Nellis Tower. Turtle 1 cleared as filed." Richard brought the Turtle's drive online and lifted the ship to a hover. While the ship's systems held it stationary, Richard pulled his hand out of the flight controller and activated the hologram. Using hand gestures, He panned the display and zoomed in on the rendered Argonian formation. It still hovered over the Atlantic. Behind him, some of the personnel whispered excitedly. Selecting a point just aft of the largest ship, Richard made a quick poking motion. The now familiar oil can pop echoed through the turtle's cabin, and concentric green rings radiated from the tip of his finger. He toggled a command on the flight console's curved display, activating the autopilot's flight plan. Trying not to be too obvious, he watched the crowd, grinning knowingly as the ship blasted into the sky and the entire group twitched and then laughed self-consciously. Even the Admiral looked duly impressed. The ship continued to rocket straight up, its supersonic climb unheard by anyone on the ground. Scientists at Area 51 still didn't know how it did that, why the ship's extreme speed didn't generate a shockwave or a sonic boom. Through the view wall, he could already see Earth's curvature. The sky rapidly shifted from blue to black. A welcome, familiar voice emanated from the Turtle's radio. "Turtle 1, this is the Galactic Guardian, over. Galactic Guardian, this is Turtle 1. Good to hear your voice, sir. I hear you have the red carpet out for us." "It's good to hear your voice, too. Yes, I do. Just parked the Turtle a couple of 100 yards after the carrier. I'll have the tractor beam bring you in from there." "Tractor beam? Oh, yeah, buddy. There's plenty I need to tell you," Jake said. Richard glanced over his shoulder. "Roger, Galactic Guardian. We've got a couple of surprises for you as well." Chapter 13. Jake turned to see two armed men step onto the bridge, followed by a lone, sharply dressed Navy commander. He wasn't surprised by their sudden appearance. Through his Eon interface, he'd watched the command group's progress from the hangar to his location. Following Jake's trail of neon breadcrumbs and bracketed by a team of surly, gun-toting special ops types, Richard had led the group through the ship. Following the command staff, a gaggle of support personnel loaded down with gear had tried to keep up, as another contingent of armed escorts covered their six. Along the way, they had paused and stared into several of the expansive halls and massive terrariums. Each of the latter contained unique alien biospheres. Accessing information on them, Jake had been surprised to discover some of those micro-environments could be dangerous. He'd been ready to wave them off. However, none of the group members had strayed off of the path. Colonel Newcastle had instructed Jake to hand over command of the Galactic Guardian and its fleet to the party's senior officer, an order with which Jake was more than happy to comply. The man was exhausted. This had been the longest day of his life. He needed sleep. But first, he wanted a hot shower. The odor rising from the neck collar of his spacesuit was making his eyes water. Jake had been very happy to discover that showers did exist on the ship and couldn't wait to climb into one. Not wanting the command group to find him floating godlike on the transparent force field floor, he had moved to the lower level of the bridge to greet them properly. Presently, he stood beneath the command deck at the center of the room. As the armed men scrutinized the large chamber for hidden threats, Captain Giard and the naval officer exchanged salutes. The woman scanned the bridge with unbridled awe, her mouth agape. Jake heard the rest of the group approaching. Recovering from her astonishment, the naval commander collected herself and shouted, "Attention on the bridge!" Then Colonel Newcastle and a fresh-looking Captain Allison, along with a senior naval officer in a crisp white uniform, stepped onto the bridge. Behind them, the rest of the command contingent stood beneath the entrance's 60-foot-tall pointed arch and stared in wide-eyed amazement. Jake recognized the senior officer's rank insignia as Fleet Admiral. Already standing at attention, Jake saluted. "Welcome aboard the Galactic Guardian, sir. The bridge is yours." The Admiral returned the salute and lowered his arm. "No, Captain, I believe you can keep it for just a few more moments." Hesitantly, Jake dropped his salute. Concerned he'd muffed the handoff, he stood at silent attention. Catching a glimpse of Richard in his peripheral vision, he saw the son of a bitch smirking. Recovering, Jake said, "Excuse me, sir." The Admiral held up a hand, cutting Jake off. "The name is Admiral Johnston, but you can just call me Admiral for short." His eyes gleamed humorlessly. "I'm going to like this guy," Jake thought. He nodded. Yes, Admiral. I know you have plenty to tell us, and believe me, I can't wait to hear it. But there's something I want to take care of first. He turned to the commander on his right and held out a hand. At rigid attention, still looking straight ahead, Jake couldn't tell what the Navy commander placed in the Admiral's hand. Johnston stepped closer to Jake. Son, it's not every day that you get promoted 2 levels in one day, especially when you can say that it happened while you were in command of Earth's largest ship. Opening his palm, he showed Jake a pair of burnished lieutenant colonel rank insignia, silver oak leaves. The Admiral looked at Jake's form-fitting metallic suit. I guess there's nowhere to pin this to your spacesuit without compromising its integrity. He placed the insignia in Giard's hand. Jake noticed that one of the officers had begun to video him and the Admiral. Colonel Giard, Johnston said, emphasizing the new rank. In consideration of you and your team's heroic victory over the last of these Zoxith, and due to your knowledge of Argonian technology, he paused and looked significantly at their surroundings. Coupled with your success here, you and Colonel Allison will each command an Argonian fighter wing. Jake stole a quick glance at Richard. Sure enough, his old wingman was sporting Lieutenant Colonel rank insignia. He turned forward to see the Admiral looking at him expectantly. Jake nodded. Thank you, sir. It's an honor. The Admiral shook his head. The honor is mine, Colonel. Newcastle stepped up. Jake saluted him. He returned the salute and shook Jake's hand. Colonel, the big Texan said significantly. The 2 of you have your work cut out. Yes, sir, Jake said, smiling self-consciously. Now, if you'll direct us to the Eon maintenance facility, Newcastle said, his booming voice echoing in the expansive chamber. I'll take the command contingent to be implanted. The man winced. I hate the sound of that. Jake grinned. That's not too bad, sir. I'll set the lights to lead you there. The computer's already expecting you. Once you're integrated into the network, it will download the Argonian language to anyone who doesn't already have it. He paused and looked to the Admiral. Of course, it'll give you access to the ship's command protocol, sir. Perfect, Admiral Johnston said. I want you to remain on the bridge until we've completed integration. Yes, sir, Jake said. They exchanged salutes again, and the command contingent turned and left the bridge, leaving only Richard and Jake. Giard nodded to him. Wing Commander. Richard returned the gesture. Afternoon, Wing Commander. They laughed and hugged, then stood in awkward silence. After a moment, Richard said, I wish Vic could be here to be a part of this. Jake nodded. Yeah. He swallowed the lump that was trying to choke him. Finally, he pointed to Richard's rank insignia. Nice surprise. Would it have killed you to give me a heads up? If you need a heads up to appreciate a surprise, then you're really not going to like this one, a female voice said. Jake turned toward her so fast he nearly snapped his neck. One of the people he'd seen toting equipment in the wake of the command staff stepped onto the bridge. She pulled off a wide-brimmed desert camouflage hat, and her long blonde hair tumbled free. Sandy? Jake looked at Richard. What the hell is she doing here? It's good to see you too, asshole, Sandy said wryly. After a confused pause, he forgot his protest and sprinted to her. Throwing his arms around Sandy, Jake swept her off her feet and spun her around. He crushed her lips with a passionate kiss. She returned it fervently. Afterward, her smile faded as she gently touched the facial cuts and bruises he'd earned aboard the Zoxith ship. Are you okay? I'll live, Jake said, then winced. Seeing his reaction, Sandy nodded. Richard told me about Lieutenant Croft. I'm sorry, baby. Jake looked away. Sandy pulled him back to her. He died a hero, Jake, she said. He nodded. After a moment, Jake pushed aside the doubts and stared deeply into her eyes. I love you, Captain Fitzpatrick. I know, she said, smiling devilishly. Jake turned and cocked an eyebrow at Richard. I can't believe you let her come. Colonel Allison held up his hands. Hey, you're the one who decided to fall in love with a hard-headed Irish woman. Yeah, but you were already a lieutenant colonel. You could have ordered her to stay behind. Except for the fact that I like my balls just where they are, Richard protested. Sandy, still in Jake's arms, grabbed his chin and turned his face to hers. You know I'm the best fighter pilot you've ever... Jake opened his mouth to call bullshit, but she raised her own eyebrow. Giard made a tactical retreat. Sandy shook her head and added, There's no way I was staying behind. Still looking at her, Jake nodded toward Richard. You'll be assigned to Wing Commander Allison's squadron. Obviously, you can't be under my command. He looked at Richard. You brought her up here, so she's your responsibility. I want her to be your wingman. Richard raised his right hand. Consider it done, Colonel. Jake turned back to see Sandy wrinkling her nose. She smiled sardonically and theatrically waved a hand in front of her face. I hope they hurry up and get back. Someone needs a shower. Jake laughed and threw his arms around her again. Positioning the neck ring under her nose, he squeezed her to him in a bear hug that sent more of his funk flowing out of the collar. Sandy squealed and giggled. Lieutenant Colonel Jake Giard smiled. He might make it through this day after all. Here it is, Jake said with a flourish of his hands. Following him into the shipboard residence, Sandy slowed, trying not to gape. The huge cabin's bronze walls and trim matched the ship's Gothic decor. Tall, fluted casings framed pointed arch openings. Beyond them, passages led to other portions of the residence. This room alone is bigger than my parents' house. Well, bigger than it was, anyway. Considering the portion cleaved from the house by a falling chunk of Zoxith asteroid, Sandy realized it wouldn't take a very big chamber to eclipse her parents' now diminished residence. The thought dredged up emotions that Sandy wasn't yet ready to explore. She'd already told Jake of her father's injury. She'd also told him of her deadly encounter with the looters, but had omitted the near rape. The memory sent a shiver down Sandy's spine. Jake paused and stepped toward her. Apparently mistaking Sandy's reaction, he started to put his arms around her. Sorry about your dad, baby. I'm sure he... Sandy shoved Jake away. I'm fine, she said too sharply. After a moment, she sighed. Sorry, Jake, you're right. He'll recover. It could have been a lot worse. A confused look crossed Jake's face. He hadn't pushed Sandy about the looters, but now she could see him studying her. Before he could start asking questions, Sandy gestured toward the expansive room. Give me the grand tour. When Jake hesitated, Sandy raised an eyebrow. Jake lifted his hands in surrender. I know that look. After a final confused glance, he turned back toward the room. Welcome to your new home. My new home, Sandy said. Why don't we make it our new home? Jake froze, motionless except for his slowly descending jaw. Sandy reached up and pushed his mouth closed. He blinked and then said, Who are you and what have you done with my girlfriend? Sandy waved a dismissive hand. There's plenty of room. You probably won't even get on my nerves. Listen here, Ms. Independent. Available space wasn't an issue, Jake said. I've been trying to convince you to move in with me for a year now. You always said it was too soon. Hey, Sandy said through a crooked smile. It's a woman's prerogative to change her mind. It was all she could do not to look at her stomach. Jake looked skeptical. What changed? With both hands, Sandy gestured toward the room. What hasn't? Seeing more questions forming, Sandy placed a finger across his lips. If this day has taught me anything, it's how fleeting life can be. I always thought we had our whole life to take things to the next level, and I still do. It's just that our whole life is now more of a variable. We've both been in combat before. We knew life could be stolen from a person without their knowledge. Death is rarely like in the movies. You don't see it coming. There are no drawn-out goodbyes. One moment you're walking down the street, the next instant you're dead and don't know it. Didn't even know you were in peril. You just end. Jake nodded. But now it can happen on a much larger scale. A shadow of dark emotions crossed his face. Sandy thought he must be remembering his front row seat for the day's tragic events, all capped off by the decapitation of Lieutenant Croft. Sandy stepped closer and wrapped her arms around Jake. We have a lot of work to do here. We need to maximize every minute of duty time. She gave him a meaningful look. But I want to make the most of our downtime as well. Jake's eyes focused, and a grin slowly surfaced. On that note, let's begin the grand tour in the bedroom, he said. He reached to pick her up. Sandy held up her hands and wrinkled her nose. Shower first, Colonel. Clad in fresh spacesuit, Jake stepped from the closet-like cabinet that had grown from the bedroom's floor. I'm going to head to the hangar and get the bag y'all brought for me. Jake gestured at his spacesuit. Fresh nanobots or not, I'm really tired of wearing this thing. After he'd showered, they had collapsed onto the bed. Then they'd made love, a long, passionate exchange that ended with both of them panting and spent. Finally, Jake had risen from the bed and stepped into the spacesuit locker completely nude. Sandy gave his groin a meaningful look and then consulted her watch. Including the 2-minute shower, you got to take off the spacesuit for 5 whole minutes, she said facetiously. Jake laughed. 5 minutes, my ass, that was at least 6. Sandy smiled wickedly and flipped him the bird. Go get your bag, Colonel, and get your butt back in bed. We both had a very long day. Jake laughed at her middle finger salute, and then his brow furrowed. Baby, there's so much to do. I need to— No, mister, Sandy said, cutting him off. You've already saved the world enough times for one day. Jake opened his mouth to protest. Sandy raised a finger and cocked an eyebrow. Are you trying to get kicked out on your first night? Jake held up both hands. I surrender. You win. To the hangar and straight back. Good. Now that that's settled, is there any way I can contact my mom back in Nellis? I want to check on Daddy. Jake paused, staring blankly, his eyes unfocused. Sandy pursed her lips. Hello? He snapped out of his trance. Sorry, I was accessing my Eon. Suddenly, a chime came from her crumpled flight suit where it lay forgotten on the room's floor. It was her cell phone's incoming text alert. She cast a questioning look at Jake. He shrugged a shoulder. I created a virtual repeater and linked it to a Nellis area cell tower by tapping into its microwave radio link. Now that's pretty impressive. How did you learn to do that so quickly? Sandy said. I wish I could take credit, but the ship's system is pretty smart. It did all the hard work. I just pointed out your device. It accessed your phone and deciphered the communications protocols. After that, it downloaded the GPS coordinates and frequencies for the most recent cell towers the phone had accessed. Luckily, we're far enough east of Nellis that one of the towers had a microwave communication link that happens to point in our general direction. Okay. Sandy paused, shaking her head. Thanks for the telecom tutorial, Captain Techie. You lost me at communications protocol. You should have just said the ship did it. Hey, you asked. It's not my fault you can't understand anything that doesn't have nuts and bolts and comes with spark plugs. Jake gave her his patented crooked smile. And that's Colonel Techie to you, he said with a wink. Having collected her phone, Sandy threw her flight suit at him. Get the hell out of here before I make you go back into that spacesuit locker. Jake saluted her. Yes, ma'am. Sandy grinned and flipped him off again. As Jake left the room, she unlocked her phone and dialed her mom. To her relief, it started ringing almost immediately, and to her greater relief, her mother answered on the first one. Sandra? Sandy smiled as an enormous weight lifted from her shoulders. With a single word, her mother's voice told her everything she needed to know. The feisty, humorous edge to her voice said Daddy was fine. Hi, Mom, Sandy said. I hope you're behaving. Well, I don't give two shits what they think, but those doctors got another thing coming if they think I'll sit by quietly while they ignore my Johnny. Sandy heard her daddy in the background. "Damn it, woman, I told you I'm fine. Quit pestering them." Sandy laughed. Even from 1,000 miles away, she could picture them bickering. There was no malice on either side, more playful banter than true argument. Her daddy called it terms of endearment wrapped in burlap. "Put her on speaker, firecracker," her dad said, calling Sandy's mom by her well-earned nickname. "Firecracker," her mother said with a harumph. "I'll shove a firecracker right up your ass," she added, apparently forgetting her earlier concern for her husband's health. "Listen to Mr. I still have a flip phone trying to tell me how to work a smartphone." During the last half of her mother's tirade, her voice gained an echo. The edge faded from her elderly voice as she added, "We can both hear you now, hon." "Daddy?" "Pumpkin." The returning strength in his voice brought a tear to Sandy's eye. "How are you, Daddy?" "Oh, I'll live," he said gruffly. "Your mother's nagging will put me 6 feet under way sooner than the loss of a leg." Several minutes later, and after deflecting multiple inquiries as to her whereabouts, Sandy said, "It was great to hear your voices, but I better go. I love you both." "Bye-bye, Pumpkin," her daddy said. "Just a sec, hon," her mother said. Through her phone's speakers, Sandy heard the rustle and shuffling of her mother standing and walking. Faintly, she heard her say, "I'll be right back, Johnny." After the click of a closing door, her mom's voice returned in a whisper. "Does he know?" Sandy blinked. "Does who know what, Mom?" "Don't be coy with me, Sandra." Sandy sat up on the bed. "Wait, how do you know?" Her mother chuckled. "Oh, let's see. I'm not sure if it was the 5th or the 15th time your hand went to your stomach while we tried to make our way around that big old rock that hit our street." Sandy winced. Had she been that obvious? Looking down, she realized even now her hand rested on her abdomen. Self-consciously, she lowered it, resolving to break that unfortunate habit. "Listen, Mom, I'm sorry I didn't say anything, but I just found out before all this." She paused, looking around the alien room. "Before all this shit happened?" her mother said. "Yes, Mama." Sandy hesitated again. A tear threatened to crest her lower eyelid. She swiped it away brusquely. It wasn't just this shit. The attempted rape at the hands of a couple of white trash meth heads had scarred her as badly as the day's otherworldly events. The looters had come from a section of California affectionately referred to as Calabama. But those assholes didn't have the sunny southern disposition she affiliated with the region. What the fuck Buck and his psychotic brother Leroy had nearly robbed her whole family, baby and all, of their lives. Before her mother could interrupt, Sandy continued. "But I'll be damned if I'm going to let them pull me from this. We don't know how long this break will last. Hell, we don't know how much longer humanity will last. I won't be doing my baby any favors if I convalesce while the world burns down around my ears." The sharpness fell from her mother's tone. "No, dear, you wouldn't. But you need to tell your man. Jake deserves that much. No, Mama, I don't want him distracted, not any more than my being here already has. Besides, he's just as likely to order me back to the surface or find someone who will." After a moment's hesitation, her mother said, "Fine. But I suggest you stop holding your stomach like you have a prolapsed abdominal hernia. The little booger won't fall out of your belly. Not for several more months, anyway." Sandy smiled. "Yes, ma'am."
Hey, co-pilots, that's the end of part 1, but there's 2 more to go, so click the link here for part 2 and see what happens next. If you don't see it, subscribe and click the bell to get notified when part 2 comes out. Anyway, that's it. Thanks. Bye.
Print copyright 2016, Dean M. Cole. Audio production copyright 2019, Dean M. Cole. Published in arrangement with Blue Heron Audio. All rights reserved.